Adrian Vale slid the promotion letter across the table and watched his wife's face go still. He didn't flinch. He didn't explain. He simply turned to the 29-year-old woman sitting beside him and said, "Vanessa will be taking the expansion director position effective immediately." Natalie Vale had spent 2 years building that role from nothing. She had negotiated the contracts, secured the partnerships, protected the man everyone feared, and in 30 seconds he handed her life's work to his mistress. Right there, in front of his mother, in front of his brother, in front of everyone. If you've ever given everything to someone who gave your place away to someone else, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night Natalie Vale stopped saving the most dangerous man in Chicago. The anniversary dinner was supposed to be a celebration. That was what the invitation said. That was what the flowers said. White peonies, Natalie's favorite, arranged along the center of the long dining table inside the Vale estate, a stone manor sitting on 12 private acres outside Chicago, where the city's noise couldn't reach, and where for 12 years Natalie Vale had learned to keep her voice at exactly the right volume. Not too loud, never too loud. The table had been set for 14. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. The kitchen staff had spent 2 days preparing food that nobody would remember eating. Evelyn Vale, Adrian's 71-year-old mother, sat at the far end in her usual pearl necklace and her usual expression of careful, watchful dignity. Cole Vale, Adrian's younger brother, sat across from Natalie with the easy posture of someone who had never quite grown comfortable at these dinners, but had learned to fake it well enough. Several senior associates and their wives filled the remaining chairs. Everyone was already halfway through their appetizers. Adrian was late. That wasn't unusual. Adrian Vale had been late to almost every important moment in Natalie's life that didn't directly involve his business. He had been late to her father's funeral. He had been late to the dinner where Natalie announced she had recovered $3 million from a banking partnership gone catastrophically wrong, a recovery that would have taken his CFO 6 months longer and cost twice the legal fees. He had even been late to their own wedding, though that particular story had been retold so many times by his associates that it had somehow transformed into charming mythology rather than what it actually was, a man who had never learned that other people's time mattered. Natalie lifted her wine glass and did not check the door. She had stopped watching the door approximately 4 years ago. Cole caught her eye from across the table and gave her a small apologetic shrug, the kind of gesture brothers-in-law give when they know their family is embarrassing itself, but lack the authority to stop it. Natalie responded with a smile so practiced it belonged in a museum. She had been perfecting that smile since the first year of their marriage, when she realized that a woman sitting quietly with a composed expression made people around her comfortable, and comfortable people made fewer suspicious decisions. She was a forensic accountant by training and by nature. She understood patterns. She understood what numbers revealed when people thought nobody was paying attention. And she had spent 12 years applying that same forensic precision to the people around her husband. The front door opened at 7:43. Natalie heard the footsteps before she heard his voice. 2 sets of footsteps, one familiar, one slightly lighter, moving across the marble entryway, with a particular kind of confidence that came from people who believed the room would rearrange itself for them. She set her wineglass down. Adrian appeared in the doorway of the dining room, wearing a charcoal suit and the expression he always wore when entering any room. Measured authority, the faint suggestion of danger, the practiced ease of a man accustomed to everyone immediately adjusting their attention toward him. He was handsome in the way that photographs would never quite capture. It wasn't just his face, it was the way he occupied space, as though gravity worked slightly differently around him. Beside him was a woman Natalie had met once before at a business function. Vanessa Cross was 29 years old, the daughter of Marcus Cross, one of Adrian's most valuable business allies. She was striking in a deliberate way, red dress, careful makeup, the particular stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Because she had. Natalie could see it immediately, the slight upward tilt of her chin, the way she stood just close enough to Adrian to make a statement without quite crossing into certainty. Natalie understood everything in approximately 4 seconds. She understood it the way she understood a falsified balance sheet, not through emotion, but through the recognition of a pattern that had been building for much longer than this moment. She felt something move through her chest, Not quite pain, not quite surprise, something colder and more final, like a door swinging shut in a house you've decided to leave. "Sorry for the delay," Adrian said to the table, as though 14 people had not been sitting in silence waiting for him. He moved to his chair at the head of the table without looking directly at Natalie. Traffic coming from the city was terrible. Evelyn Vale watched her son with the expression of a woman who had outlived her husband's empire and her own certainties. She said nothing. She rarely did in rooms full of men who believed they were managing her. Cole said, "We ordered the first course." Adrian nodded, still not looking at Natalie. Vanessa Cross sat down in the empty chair to Adrian's right, the chair that Natalie had arranged to be empty, so she could move to Adrian's side after the first toast, which was a small tradition they had maintained for the last 8 years. Vanessa sat in it with the careful naturalness of someone who had been told where to sit and had practiced not looking like she'd been told. Natalie watched this happen and said nothing. The table resumed its careful conversation. Someone discussed a property acquisition in Michigan. Someone else mentioned a logistics contract that had been renegotiated successfully. Natalie answered 2 direct questions from associates' wives with exactly the right amount of warmth and information. She ate her salad. She smiled at Cole when he made a dry joke about Chicago winters. She performed the entire ritual of the composed wife with such perfection that 3 different people would later tell investigators they had no idea anything was wrong during dinner. That was the point. Natalie Vale had never been predictable. She had only ever appeared to be. It was Adrian himself who broke the surface. He did it approximately 40 minutes into dinner when the main course arrived and the conversation had warmed slightly from wine and the comfortable arrogance of powerful men who believed they were safe inside their own walls. He reached for his wine glass, and in that motion, something settled on his face, a decision that had clearly been made long before tonight, that he had merely been waiting for the right theatrical moment to announce. "I want to share something with the people who matter most to me," Adrian said. The table quieted. Evelyn went very still. Cole's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Natalie set down her own fork very slowly because her hands had understood something her mind was still catching up to. "Vale Meridian's expansion division has been growing faster than we expected." Adrian continued, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a man delivering prepared remarks. "We need real leadership for the next phase. Someone who understands the business from the outside and can bring new thinking." He paused. He glanced at Vanessa. "I'm appointing Vanessa Cross as the new director of the expansion division effective at the beginning of next quarter." The silence lasted perhaps 2 full seconds. Then it was replaced by the sounds of men who work for powerful people and have learned to applaud whatever those powerful people decide, small affirmations nodding the careful social performance of approval. Natalie did not move. She heard Cole's fork click against his plate. She heard Evelyn draw a breath through her nose with the precision of a woman stopping herself from speaking. She heard Vanessa say something gracious and polished about being honored by the trust, and she heard Adrian respond warmly, and she heard all of it from what felt like the bottom of a very deep, very quiet pool. The expansion division, the position Natalie had spent 22 months building the infrastructure for, the position she had written the operational framework for, the position she had recruited 3 of the key executives for, had negotiated with 2 banking partners to support, had structured the entire financial compliance model for, because without that compliance model, the expansion division would have drawn the kind of regulatory scrutiny that could have unraveled half of Vale Meridian's legitimate holdings. Adrian had just handed that position to a 29-year-old woman who wore red dresses and sat in chairs that belonged to other people, and he had done it at their anniversary dinner, in front of his mother, in front of his brother, in front of everyone. Natalie understood now that this was not a business decision. Business decisions didn't require audiences. This was a message. It was the kind of message men like Adrian delivered when they had decided something and wanted the decision witnessed, because witnesses made things real in a way that private conversations never could. He was rewriting the record of who mattered in his world, and he had chosen to do it tonight on the 12-year anniversary of the night she had agreed to stand beside him. Something very old and very patient inside Natalie Vale finally finished waiting. She reached for her wine glass with absolute steadiness and took a single slow sip. Then she set the glass down. Then she looked at her left hand resting on the white tablecloth beside her plate. Her wedding ring caught the candlelight. She thought about the first time she had ever looked closely at Adrian Vale's financial records, not as his wife, but as the woman he had asked for help when his father's company was hemorrhaging money through 17 different hidden leaks. She had stayed up for 3 nights straight, cross-referencing accounts, following the money through a deliberately complex maze of shell entities and misdirected payments, and she had found every single one of those leaks and plugged them. Adrian had presented her findings to his board as his own analysis, and Natalie had watched that happen and had told herself it was fine, that being the person behind the person was a kind of power, that love sometimes meant lifting the person you loved even when they forgot to acknowledge the lift. She had told herself that for 12 years. She had been wrong for 12 years. Natalie removed her wedding ring. The motion was quiet enough that only Cole, sitting directly across from her, actually saw it happen. His face changed instantly, not with shock, but with the particular pained recognition of someone watching a slow disaster finally complete itself. Natalie placed the ring beside Adrian's wineglass. It made a small sound against the crystal, a sound like the period at the end of a very long sentence. Adrian was in the middle of saying something to one of his associates. He stopped. He looked at the ring beside his glass. Then he looked at Natalie with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, but something unsteady and almost frightened, the expression of a man who has suddenly realized the floor he believed was solid has been made of something else entirely. "Natalie," he said, "I won't fight for you anymore." Her voice was perfectly level. It wasn't cold, it wasn't theatrical, it was simply honest, spoken at a moderate volume in a room that had gone so quiet the candles seemed to hold their breath. Then she pushed her chair back from the table, lifted her handbag from the hook on her chair arm, and picked up the thin black leather case that had been sitting on the floor beside her feet. She walked out. The room stayed frozen for approximately 5 seconds after the front door closed behind her. Adrian stared at the space where she had been sitting. The ring caught the candlelight beside his glass. The white peonies stood in their vases. The food cooled on 14 plates. Then Cole's voice broke the silence. "Where did she get the black case?" Something changed on Adrian's face. The uncertainty was replaced by something sharper, something that looked very much like the expression he wore when the ground had genuinely shifted. He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped back from the table. 2 of the associates moved instinctively, men trained to respond when their employer moved suddenly. Evelyn Vale watched her son with the calm of a woman who has lived long enough to know that certain rooms can only be left by the person who entered them first. "The case," Adrian said, and his voice was different now, stripped of its performance down to something rough and real. "The black case from my office." Cole was already standing. She carried it out the front door. One of the senior associates, a heavy-set man named Braddock, who had been with the organization for 20 years, crossed his arms and said quietly, "Mr. Vale, if that case contains what I think it contains—" "Everyone sit down," Adrian said. Nobody sat down. "Braddock, sit down." Braddock sat. Adrian stood at the head of his anniversary dinner with his wife's wedding ring beside his glass and his mother watching him and his brother already moving toward the door, and he looked at the exit Natalie had used, and every person in the room could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of exactly what he had just done, what it had cost him, and what was walking out of his world inside a black leather case. Because the black case was never supposed to leave his private office. Because the black case contained something that 3 people in the world knew existed, and now one of those 3 people had walked out of his house carrying it in one hand and 12 years of patience in the other. Adrian turned to Cole. "Find her," he said. "You find her right now." "And then?" Cole asked. The room waited. Adrian's jaw tightened. His eyes went to the door. Something passed across his face, some private war between the man he performed for rooms like this one and the man underneath that performance, the man who had spent 12 years being quietly saved by the woman he had just publicly erased. "Nobody touches her," he said. "Nobody follows her parents. Nobody makes a single move against her or anyone connected to her." He paused. "You find her, and you tell her I need to speak with her." Cole looked at his brother for a long moment. "She's going to say no," Cole said. "I know," said Adrian. And that was the moment, not the ring, not the announcement, not even the look on Vanessa Cross's face as she quietly gathered her things and made her own careful exit. That was the moment every person left in that dining room understood that Adrian Vale was afraid, Not of what Natalie had taken, afraid of what he had finally made her into, someone who was done. Cole found Natalie's car already gone from the estate's private drive. The security log showed she had requested the gate opened at 7:51 p.m., which meant she had been planning to leave before dessert was served, which meant she had known, which meant she had come to this dinner tonight not to be surprised by Adrian's announcement, but to hear it confirmed, to sit through it, to carry the weight of 12 years of quiet labor and careful invisibility one final time and then set it down. The ring wasn't an impulse. The ring was a conclusion. Cole stood in the cold drive with his phone in his hand and called Natalie's number 3 times. 3 times it rang through to voicemail. He stood there long enough to watch the temperature drop another 2 degrees, then went back inside and told Adrian she wasn't answering. Adrian spent the next hour in his private study. The anniversary dinner continued without him, in a half-hearted performance that nobody had the energy to properly sustain. Vanessa Cross was gone by 8:30. Evelyn Vale had her car brought around by 9. The associates left with the careful neutrality of men who had learned not to take sides until they understood which side had the better position. By 10 p.m., Adrian was alone in his study with the ledger's usual shelf space staring back at him and a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, the Atlas Ledger. He had asked Natalie to create it in the 4th year of their marriage, when he had inherited enough of the business to understand that the legitimate empire and its more complicated counterpart had become dangerous intertwined. 2 different worlds running through the same financial architecture, visible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. He had told Natalie it was insurance, a record of separation, something that proved, if anyone ever needed proving, that Vale Meridian's legitimate holdings were clean. Natalie had agreed. She had spent 18 months building it from scratch, cross-referencing 12 years of financial history, corporate filings, banking records, partnership agreements. She had built it with the same forensic precision she brought to everything, which meant it was thorough in ways Adrian had never fully appreciated, because he had trusted her to handle it, and trusting someone to handle something meant you eventually stopped looking at what they were actually building. He had thought the ledger was his protection. He had not considered what else it might contain, and now the woman who had built it was gone. Adrian's phone rang at 11:47 p.m., not Cole, not any of his associates. It was a number he recognized as belonging to Natalie's attorney, Rachel Monroe, a federal compliance specialist Natalie had known since graduate school. The call lasted 43 seconds. Rachel Monroe said 3 sentences. The first was that Natalie Vale was safe and had legal representation. The second was that no contact should be made through unofficial channels. The third was that Adrian should expect communication through proper legal representatives in the coming days. Then she hung up. Adrian set his phone on his desk. He sat with the silence of his private study, and the empty shelf, and the untouched whiskey, and he thought about the expression on Natalie's face when he had announced Vanessa's appointment, not the hurt he had expected, not the anger he had prepared himself to manage, but something worse than both of those things. The expression of a woman who had already known, who had come prepared, who had made her decision before she walked through his front door and had sat through his public announcement, not because she was powerless to stop it, but because she was done saving him from himself. He thought about the black case. He thought about 18 months of documents he had never fully read. He thought about every time he had handed Natalie a crisis and walked away confident she would resolve it, and every time she had resolved it, and every time he had received the credit, and every time she had accepted his explanation that this was simply how things worked, that her role was support and his role was face, and she had said yes for 12 years and apparently meant something else entirely. He picked up his phone and called Cole. "I need to know everything she's been working on for the last 6 months," Adrian said when Cole answered. "Every meeting, every document, every contact." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Adrian," he said carefully, "before you do that, there's something you should probably see first." "What?" "She sent you an email 6 months ago." Another pause. "And 8 months ago, and 14 months ago." "What kind of email?" "The kind," Cole said, "about Gavin." The study went very quiet. Adrian stared at the empty shelf. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying," Cole said slowly, "that Natalie has been trying to tell you something for over a year, and you told her she was wrong, and now she's gone, and she took the one thing that might explain why she was right." Adrian set the phone down without ending the call. He sat in the silence of his study for a very long time. Outside Chicago moved through its usual night traffic sirens, the distant lights of a city that did not stop for anyone's private reckonings. In a modest condominium across the city, registered in a name that Adrian's associates had never thought to look for, Natalie Vale was sitting across from Rachel Monroe with the Atlas ledger open between them. She was not crying. She had done her crying privately months ago when she had first understood what she was looking at inside those documents. She had given herself 3 days. Then she had closed that door and begun building the only kind of exit that actually worked. Not the dramatic kind, not the impulsive kind, but the kind that arrives so prepared and so complete that the person being left cannot follow. Rachel was reading. Her expression had shifted twice in the last 20 minutes, from professional calm to something considerably more complicated. "Natalie," Rachel said. She paused. "These entries you marked in red." "I know. You didn't make these entries." "No. Someone modified the ledger." "Yes." Rachel looked up. "How long?" Natalie folded her hands on the table. "Based on the digital metadata, approximately 3 years, maybe a little longer." She met Rachel's eyes. The transfers started small, amounts that would read as standard operational expenses if you weren't specifically looking for the pattern. Then they got larger. Then they started involving property. Rachel sat back in her chair. "The authorization codes beside these transactions," she said carefully. "They're Adrian's." "Yes," Natalie said, "which is why nobody questioned them." "But he didn't make these transactions." "No," said Natalie, "he didn't." Rachel was quiet for a moment with the weight of that information. "Who did?" she asked. Natalie opened to a page near the back of the ledger. She placed her finger on a name that appeared in a partially obscured notation, visible only if you knew what kind of encoding had been used in the original filing. Rachel read it. Her expression went very still. "Gavin Rourke," she said. "Gavin Rourke," Natalie confirmed. Outside the windows, Chicago continued its unconcerned night. Somewhere across the city, Adrian Vale sat in his study with a glass of untouched whiskey and the beginning of an understanding that was going to cost him everything he thought he knew. And in a modest condominium, the woman he had underestimated for 12 consecutive years opened the Atlas ledger to the beginning and started walking Rachel Monroe through exactly what she had built and exactly what it proved and exactly how long she had been carrying this knowledge alone. "He needs to figure this out for himself," Natalie said at one point when Rachel asked whether she planned to tell Adrian directly about Gavin. "He could be in real danger if he doesn't know." "He's been in real danger for 3 years," Natalie said quietly, "and every time I tried to tell him, he told me I was paranoid, that I distrusted his family, that I was trying to control him." She paused. "I've been warning him about Gavin Rourke for 14 months. He has my emails. He has my exact words. He dismissed every single one." She closed the ledger carefully. "He's a smart man, Rachel. He doesn't need me to save him. He needs to be in a position where he has to save himself." Rachel studied her friend. "And if he can't," Natalie looked out the window at the city below. "Then he'll finally understand," she said, "exactly what I have been preventing." The room held that truth quietly between them, and Chicago turned slowly beneath a sky full of clouds that had been building all evening, promising weather that would arrive in its own time, regardless of what anyone on the ground had planned. The night had started as an anniversary. It had ended as a reckoning. And the most dangerous room in Adrian Vale's world was no longer his private study or his boardroom or any of the carefully controlled spaces where powerful men decided the futures of less powerful people. It was a modest condominium across the city where a forensic accountant had just opened a ledger that contained 12 years of truth and had started finally to use it not as a weapon, not as revenge, but as the one tool that had always been hers. Understanding. And the patience to let other people reach it on their own. The morning after the anniversary dinner, Adrian Vale did not sleep. He sat in his private study until 4 a.m. with Cole across from him and 3 laptops open on the desk, and he did something he had not done in years. He read, not contracts, not financial summaries prepared by other people and delivered to him in clean, simple language. He read Natalie's emails, all of them, starting from the most recent and working backward through 14 months of carefully written, carefully worded, carefully ignored correspondence that his wife had sent him while he was busy doing other things. The first email was dated 14 months ago. The subject line was simply, "Gavin, please read this." Adrian opened it. He read it once, then he read it again. Then he closed the laptop and sat very still for approximately 2 minutes. "She wrote to you 14 months ago," Cole said quietly from the chair across the desk. He was not asking. He already knew. He had known since last night when he had pulled the email records himself. "She told you something was wrong with the Meridian accounts." "She said there were irregularities," Adrian said. "She said more than that. She speculated." "Adrian." Cole's voice was flat. "She named Gavin, by name, 14 months ago." The room held that fact between them like something neither man wanted to touch directly. Adrian opened the laptop again. He scrolled down through the email, 3 pages single-spaced with specific account numbers, specific transaction dates, specific discrepancy amounts laid out in the organized, methodical language of a woman who had spent her career proving things that other people could not see. At the bottom, Natalie had written, "I know this is difficult to consider. I know Gavin has been part of your family since before you can remember. But the numbers don't lie for people, Adrian. They never have. Please look at this before you dismiss it." He had responded in 4 sentences. He had told her she was reading the accounts incorrectly. He had told her that Gavin's access to certain transactions was authorized, and she simply wasn't aware of the authorization. He had told her that her distrust of Gavin had always been a point of tension, and he hoped she could work past it. And he had ended with a sentence that now sat in his chest like a stone. "I trust Gavin with my life. I need you to trust my judgment." She had never responded to that email. She had sent a second one 8 months later with updated figures. He had replied with 2 sentences that time. And then a third email 6 months ago, the most detailed of all 3 with documentation attached, and that one he had never opened at all. It had sat in his inbox unread for 6 months while Gavin Rourke sat across from him at meetings and advised him on strategy and called him son in the particular way that had always made Adrian feel against his better instincts like a protected child. "She sent me everything," Adrian said. "She sent you everything," Cole confirmed. Adrian pushed the laptop away. He picked up the whiskey he still hadn't touched from the night before and finally drank all of it in a single motion. He set the glass down hard. "Why didn't she push harder?" he said. And the question came out with an edge of frustration that he immediately recognized was wrong, directed at the wrong person, a reflex from 12 years of being the man who was never wrong in his own house. Cole looked at him, just looked at him, with the particular expression of a younger brother who has spent his entire adult life watching his older brother make decisions and has learned to say certain things only with his face. Adrian heard himself. He heard exactly what he had just said, and he felt the full weight of it land somewhere behind his sternum. "She did push," Cole said finally. 3 times. You pushed back." The silence in the study was total. Somewhere in that silence, Adrian Vale began to understand that the thing he had lost the night before was not his wife's compliance. It was not her presence at his table, or her ring on her finger, or her name beside his in the social architecture of a world that paid attention to those things. What he had lost was the only person in his orbit who had been telling him the truth. By 6 a.m., Adrian had called his internal finance director, Marcus Webb, and told him to pull every transaction record touching the expansion division accounts for the last 4 years. Webb, who was careful and experienced and had worked for Adrian long enough to understand when questions were being asked that didn't yet have names attached to them, said he would have preliminary results by noon. At 6:15, Adrian called Braddock. "I need to know," Adrian said without preamble, "who else has had access to my authorization codes in the last 3 years?" Braddock was quiet for a moment. "That's a short list. Give it to me. You, me, Natalie, your tech infrastructure manager, Danny Cho, and—" another pause, shorter but heavier. "Gavin. Gavin has had emergency access since your father's time." Adrian said nothing. "Mr. Vale," Braddock said carefully, "is there something specific I should be looking for?" "Not yet," Adrian said. "Keep this between us." He hung up. The preliminary report from Webb arrived at 11:58 a.m. Adrian read it at his desk with Cole standing behind him, and by the 3rd page, Cole put both hands on the desk and leaned forward and said very quietly, "Adrian, I see it. That's $12 million. I see it. In 3 years." "Cole." Adrian's voice was controlled in the particular way that meant the control was costing him something significant. I see it. $12 million moved in increments, carefully sized to avoid triggering automatic review thresholds. $12 million routed through 3 layers of subsidiary companies, 2 of which Adrian had never seen in any board presentation. $12 million that appeared in the surface-level accounts as a combination of operational expenses, consulting fees, and property maintenance costs, the kind of line items that got approved in bulk at quarterly reviews without individual scrutiny, because that was what trusted advisors were for. Because that was what Gavin was for. Adrian stood up from his desk and walked to the window. He stood there for a long moment. "She knew," he said. Not bitterly, not with the anger that would have been easier, just with the stripped-down recognition of a man who has picked up a piece of evidence and turned it over and understood finally exactly what it means. "She figured this out, and she told me, and I called her paranoid." Cole didn't answer. There was no answer that would have helped. "I need to find her," Adrian said. "Rachel Monroe has made it very clear. I'm not going to threaten her, Cole." He turned from the window. His face was different now than it had been 12 hours ago. The performance was completely gone, the careful authority, the measured power, all of it stripped away by a night without sleep, and 12 pages of financial evidence and 14 months of emails he had never properly read. What was underneath was something rawer and considerably less certain. "I need to tell her I was wrong." Cole looked at his brother for a moment. "She knows you were wrong," Cole said. "That's not the question. The question is what you're going to do about Gavin." Adrian looked at him. "That's exactly the question," he agreed. He picked up his phone and called Gavin Rourke at 12:14 p.m. Gavin answered on the second ring with the easy warmth he always carried, the particular avuncular confidence of a man who has spent decades making other people feel like they were in safe hands. "Adrian, heard there was some excitement last night. You doing all right?" "I need to meet," Adrian said. "Today." "Of course." Not a beat of hesitation. That was what Adrian noticed first. No hesitation at all. "Lunch, I can come to the estate." "The Meridian office, 2 p.m. A brief pause. Shorter than it should have been if Gavin had nothing to hide. "Absolutely. See you then." Adrian hung up and looked at Cole. "He didn't ask why," Adrian said. Cole understood immediately. Innocent people ask why. "Yes," said Adrian. "They do." He spent the next 90 minutes reviewing everything he could pull without triggering Gavin's awareness that anything was happening. Property transfers, corporate registration documents for subsidiary companies he had never personally authorized, consulting contracts paid to entities that, when Cole traced them backward through state registration records, ultimately pointed toward a network of holdings that appeared to be controlled by a blind trust that had been established according to the filing date approximately 18 months after Victor Vale's death. 18 months after Adrian had inherited. 18 months after Gavin Rourke had become the most trusted person in his organization. Cole found the trust document at 1:40 p.m. He read the trustee name 3 times. "Adrian," he said. Adrian was already reading over his shoulder. The trustee was a holding company registered in Delaware under a name that meant nothing on its surface, but the registered agent for that company was an attorney named Bernard Holt, and Bernard Holt had been Victor Vale's private legal counsel for the last 4 years of Victor's life. The same Bernard Holt who had handled the transition of corporate authority following Victor's death. The same Bernard Holt, whose name appeared exactly once in Natalie's 3rd email, the one Adrian had left unread for 6 months, in a footnote that read, "This name appears in 2 places it shouldn't. I think it matters." She had found it 6 months ago, and he had left her email unread. Adrian sat down in his chair. He pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed carefully for a moment, the specific controlled breathing of a man who understands that the emotion he is currently feeling is not useful and needs to be set aside until later. "She found Bernard Holt's name," he said. 6 months ago, Cole said, "before I announced Vanessa's appointment." "Yes. So she already knew, she already had most of this when she walked into that dinner last night." Cole nodded slowly. The implications of that settled over Adrian like cold water. Natalie had sat through his announcement. She had watched him hand her work to his mistress. She had removed her ring and said her 4 words and walked out, and she had been carrying all of this. Not as a weapon, not as leverage. She had been carrying it because she had discovered it and tried 3 times to tell him, and he had refused to listen, and she had finally reached the point where she understood that the only thing left was to carry it out the door and let him find his own way to the truth. The meeting with Gavin happened at 2 p.m. Gavin arrived at the Vale Meridian boardroom with his usual ease, his usual posture, his usual expression of warm, steady authority. He was 55 years old with silver hair and careful eyes, and a handshake that had always felt to Adrian like the handshake of a man who had nothing to prove. Adrian was already sitting at the head of the table. Cole stood near the window. Webb sat at the far end with a closed folder in front of him. Gavin registered Cole's presence and Webb's and the closed folder, and something shifted in his expression, a nearly imperceptible recalibration, the kind that happened in the eyes before the rest of the face caught up. He sat down. "What's this about?" Gavin asked. Easy, warm, concerned. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "When did you last review the expansion division accounts?" Adrian asked. No hesitation. "Last week. Everything looked solid. Walk me through the Meridian subsidiaries. All of them." The smallest pause. "All of them. That's Adrian, that's a long list. We have time." Gavin studied him. The warmth in his expression remained, but something behind it was doing quiet, rapid calculations. Adrian could see it, had never been able to see it before, or had never let himself look for it, the particular intelligence of a man who has spent years managing other people's perceptions, running the numbers behind a pleasant face. "Is this about Natalie?" Gavin asked. He leaned back slightly, made his voice concerned and gentle. "Adrian, I heard about last night. I understand this has been a difficult—" "It's not about Natalie," Adrian said, "because whatever she may have said to you, or whatever she may have taken when she left—" "Gavin." Adrian's voice was quiet, completely quiet, that specific quiet that everyone in the organization had learned to be very careful around. "I'm going to ask you about the subsidiaries, and I need you to walk me through every single one." Gavin looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Cole, then he looked at Webb and the closed folder. And Adrian watched the calculation complete itself behind those careful eyes and watched Gavin arrive at the same conclusion Adrian had arrived at 2 hours ago, which was that the room already knew, and the question was not whether, but only how. "I think," Gavin said slowly, "that you should talk to your attorney before we continue this conversation." "I think," Adrian replied, "that you should talk to yours." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. What happened next was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations shouted across the table, no physical confrontation. Those things happened in movies. What happened in the Vale Meridian boardroom at 2:17 p.m. was considerably quieter and considerably more devastating. Gavin Rourke stood up. He straightened his jacket with the same unhurried motion he had used 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. He looked at Adrian Vale with an expression that was no longer warm and no longer performing warmth, just direct, level, and completely cold. "You should understand," Gavin said, "that your father asked me to protect this organization. And sometimes protection means making decisions that the person being protected isn't ready to make for themselves." Adrian stared at him. "My father," Adrian said very carefully, "is dead." "Yes," said Gavin. "He is." He walked out. Cole moved toward the door. Adrian stopped him with one word. "No." Cole stopped. "Let him go," Adrian said. "We have everything we need." He looked at Webb. "Get the attorneys on the phone, all of them. I want a full independent audit initiated before end of business today." He paused. "And I want Bernard Holt's name flagged to the corporate investigators immediately." Webb nodded and left the room. Cole stayed. He looked at his brother across the empty boardroom. "What did he mean?" Cole asked. "About Dad?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said, "but Natalie does." He said it simply, without drama, without the defensive edge that would have colored those words even 48 hours ago. He said it the way you say something when you have finally stopped fighting against a truth long enough to actually look at it. Natalie knew. She had been trying to tell him for over a year, and somewhere inside the Atlas ledger, inside the document she had built with 18 months of forensic precision and carried out of his house in a black leather case, was the full architecture of what Gavin Rourke had been constructing underneath them both. Adrian picked up his phone and called Rachel Monroe's office directly. the assistant answered. Adrian gave his name. There was a pause of approximately 20 seconds during which Adrian stood at the window of his boardroom and watched traffic move below with the particular patience of a man who has recently learned what impatience has cost him. Rachel Monroe came on the line. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Professional, neutral." "I need to speak with Natalie," Adrian said. "My client. I know she doesn't want to see me. I'm not asking for a personal conversation." He paused. "There are things in that ledger that are larger than our marriage, Rachel. Things that involve my father. Things that may involve my father's death. I need her to know that I understand that now, and I need—" He stopped, regrouped. "Please tell her that I read her emails, all 3 of them. Tell her I'm sorry I didn't read them when she sent them. And tell her—" Another pause, shorter this time. "Tell her the auditors are already moving." Silence on the line. "I'll pass that along," Rachel said. "Thank you." He hung up. By 4 p.m., Vale Meridian's independent auditors had been formally engaged. By 5 p.m., Braddock had quietly confirmed to Adrian that 2 of Gavin's closest associates within the organization had requested emergency meetings with their own legal counsel, which meant the information was already moving, which meant Gavin already knew that containment was no longer possible. By 6 p.m., 3 senior business partners had called Adrian directly to express concern about rumors circulating in the financial community. Adrian took each call with the steady composure of a man who had decided what kind of person he was going to be inside this crisis, even if he hadn't yet figured out all the steps of getting there. At 6:45 p.m., Cole received a message that he read twice before bringing to Adrian. "She sent this through Rachel," Cole said, handing Adrian his phone. Adrian read it. "It was 12 words I know about Gavin. I've known for a while. I'm sorry, too. Not a reconciliation. Not an opening. Not a promise of anything beyond the bare, honest acknowledgement that they had both been living inside a deception that neither of them had authored, moving through a world that someone else had carefully arranged, and had both in their own ways been paying for it." Adrian read those 12 words 3 times. He handed the phone back to Cole. "She was always trying to protect me," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. "Yeah," Cole said. "She was." Adrian nodded slowly. He sat down in his chair. Outside the windows, Chicago was doing what Chicago always did at this hour, moving urgent, unconcerned with any individual's private reckoning, the city's enormous machinery grinding forward regardless of what fell apart inside its buildings. "Cole," Adrian said. "Yeah. What do you know about the circumstances around Dad's death?" The question landed in the room quietly, but it landed with weight. Cole looked at his brother for a long moment. "Not much more than you do," Cole said carefully. "Heart attack. He'd been declining for about a year before that." "Who managed his affairs during that year?" Cole was quiet. "Gavin," he said. "Who controlled his access to medical information?" Another pause. "Gavin. Who was the first person to advise me to take the director's seat before Dad was officially declared incapacitated?" Cole sat down. "Gavin," he said, and his voice was different now, lower. The word arrived with an entirely different weight than it had carried even that morning. Adrian nodded. He looked at his hands on the desk. "Natalie wrote in her last email, the one I didn't open, that she had found something in some old correspondence. Something about the period before Dad died. She used the word manufactured. I read that word 20 minutes ago for the first time." He paused. "Manufactured. She found something that suggested Gavin manufactured the conditions of the transition, not the death itself necessarily, but the circumstances around it." Cole stared at him. "He set you up," Cole said, "from the beginning." "He positioned me," Adrian said carefully, "a younger, less experienced figurehead who would rely on guidance, who would trust the guidance, because the guidance came wrapped in 30 years of loyalty and an almost uncle's warmth." He let out a breath. "And I did. I trusted it completely, for 12 years. And Natalie saw it." "Natalie saw the numbers," Adrian said. "And numbers don't manufacture warmth. Numbers don't tell you a story about loyalty or family or trust. They just show you where the money actually went." He stood up. "I need to get ahead of this before Gavin does," he said. "If he reaches the right people before our attorneys establish the record, he can spin this as a domestic dispute. Unstable marriage, disgruntled wife, with access to sensitive documents, husband trying to clean house." "He already thought of that," Cole said. That's why he mentioned Natalie in the boardroom. Adrian looked at him. He's going to try to make her the problem, Cole said. He's going to argue that whatever's in that ledger can't be trusted because Natalie's the one who built it, and Natalie's in the middle of a separation, and Natalie has a personal stake in damaging. Then we need the ledger independently verified before he makes that argument publicly, Adrian said. Everything she documented needs to be corroborated through sources that have nothing to do with her. That takes time. Then we start right now. He picked up his phone. Call the forensic accounting firm we used for the Portland acquisition. Get me their senior partner tonight if possible. Tell them it's a full organizational audit and I need their team in the building by Monday morning. Cole was already dialing. Adrian made 4 more calls in the next 20 minutes. He spoke to his lead corporate attorney, to the head of his board's independent oversight committee, to a federal compliance consultant he had used once before and trusted, and to his personal banker, who listened to a careful and deliberately incomplete summary of the situation and said with the measured calm of someone who had survived several varieties of financial crisis, "Adrian, whatever you need, you call me first." At 8 p.m., Adrian sat back down in his boardroom chair, and for the first time in 24 hours, the movement of pieces inside his head had a direction and a momentum. There was still enormous damage to be accounted for. There were still questions about his father that he was not yet ready to look at directly. There were still the $12 million and the shell companies and Bernard Holt's name and the blind trust and Gavin's final words in this very room, but something had shifted. Because for 12 years, whenever his world had started to come apart, Adrian Vale had done one of 2 things. He had exercised power, moved aggressively, applied pressure, used fear as currency. Or he had handed the problem to Natalie and trusted her to find the seams and sew them back together while he stood in front of the room and looked like a man whose world was perfectly in order. Tonight, he was doing neither. Tonight he was sitting with the discomfort of having made serious mistakes and facing the consequences of those mistakes with his own hands, and finding that while it was significantly harder than anything he had done before, it was also the first thing he had done in years that felt completely unambiguously real. He picked up his phone and looked at Natalie's 12 words one more time. "I know about Gavin. I've known for a while. I'm sorry too." The sorry wasn't for anything she had done. He understood that. She was sorry for the situation, sorry for the position his blindness had put them both in, sorry perhaps in the way that people who have loved someone for a long time remain sorry about things even after the loving has stopped protecting them. He set the phone down. I was going to have to face her eventually. He knew that. There were things inside the Atlas ledger that would require her to walk him through, not because he couldn't find them independently, but because she had built the document and she understood its architecture, and he had spent 12 years disregarding her expertise, and the least he could do, the very least, was finally sit across from her and acknowledge that she was the person who understood this better than anyone. But that was not tonight. Tonight there was work to do. Tonight there were auditors to engage and attorneys to brief, and a narrative to establish before Gavin Rourke spent the next 72 hours constructing one of his own. Tonight was the beginning of something Adrian could not charm or intimidate or delegate his way out of. Tonight was the night Adrian Vale had to become the man who solved his own problems. Whether he was capable of that was something he genuinely did not know yet. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was willing to find out. Across the city in a modest condominium that Adrian had never seen and could not find, Natalie Vale closed the Atlas ledger and asked Rachel Monroe a question she had been carrying for 6 months. "If the evidence about Victor is solid enough," she said, "what does that do to Adrian's inheritance?" Rachel looked at her carefully. "It complicates it. Significantly." "How significantly?" "If Gavin manipulated the transition of authority before Victor's incapacitation was officially declared," Rachel said, "some of the corporate changes made in that period could be challenged. It doesn't invalidate Adrian's position necessarily, but it creates grounds for a review of the entire succession structure." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "Which means Gavin may have a legal argument," she said slowly, "that some of the authority he assumed during that period was actually legitimate, because it happened before the formal transfer." "It's possible," Rachel said, "if he has the right attorney." Natalie sat with that for a long moment. "He's going to use it," she said. Whatever happens in the next few days, however Adrian moves against him, Gavin is going to find the legal angle that turns his theft into a gray area, and he's going to use that gray area to create enough confusion that the investigators don't know where to stand. Probably, Rachel agreed. Unless, Natalie said carefully, the evidence in this ledger is verified through independent sources before he makes that argument. Rachel looked at her. How much time do we have? Natalie asked. If Gavin moves quickly, 48 hours, maybe less. Natalie nodded once. She opened the ledger again to the section she had spent the most time building, the oldest entries, the ones that went back to the period surrounding Victor Vale's final year. The entries that documented with the quiet forensic patience that was simply how her mind worked, a pattern of financial decisions that told a very specific story about who had been in control during the months that everyone had called a transition, but which Natalie had slowly come to understand was something else entirely. She looked at those entries for a long moment. Then she looked at Rachel. "Call Adrian's corporate attorneys," she said. "Not Adrian, his attorneys. Tell them I have documentation they need to see before they file anything with the investigators." Rachel blinked. "Natalie, I'm not doing this for Adrian," Natalie said clearly. "I'm doing this because Gavin Rourke spent 12 years stealing from that organization and possibly longer manipulating the man who built it. And he is not going to turn my work into a weapon against the truth because he has better timing than we do." She closed the ledger. "Set up the meeting," she said. "Tomorrow morning, early." Rachel picked up her phone, and in the quiet of that condominium, the most important meeting of the entire crisis was arranged not by the man at the center of the empire, but by the woman who had carried its most dangerous secret out the door in a black leather case, the woman who had stopped saving him, but had not yet finished telling the truth. The attorneys arrived at 7:45 the following morning. Not Adrian's attorneys, not Gavin's. The independent corporate investigators that Natalie had requested through Rachel Monroe, a 3-person team from a firm that had handled financial misconduct cases for Fortune 500 companies, federal agencies, and twice for congressional oversight committees. They were not people who were impressed by names or afraid of powerful men, which was precisely why Natalie had chosen them. Rachel had made the call at 9:15 the previous night. By midnight, the lead investigator, a 52-year-old woman named Carol Freed, had confirmed she would have her team in position by 7:30 a.m. Carol Freed had spent 26 years finding money that powerful people believed they had hidden permanently, and she had a reputation for 2 things: absolute thoroughness and zero tolerance for wasted time. She walked into the conference room at Rachel's office, sat down across from Natalie, looked at the Atlas ledger on the table between them, and said simply, "Walk me through it from the beginning. Don't skip anything you think I already know because I don't know any of it yet." Natalie opened the ledger to page 1. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes without stopping. Carol Freed did not interrupt. She took handwritten notes in a small leather notebook with the focused efficiency of someone who was simultaneously listening, processing, and organizing a mental architecture of everything being said. Her 2 associates sat on either side of her with laptops open, cross-referencing account numbers and corporate registration data in real time as Natalie moved through the ledger section by section. At 9:53 a.m., Carol's associate on the left, a young man named Torres, who had the quiet intensity of someone who had been working financial crime cases since graduate school, looked up from his laptop and said, "The Delaware Holding Company. I've got the full registration chain." Carol looked at him. "Where does it end?" "It ends," Torres said carefully, "with a property management company registered in Nevada. The Nevada company owns 4 commercial properties, 2 in Illinois, 1 in Indiana, 1 in Wisconsin." He paused. "The Illinois properties are both within 3 miles of Vail Meridian warehouse facilities." The room went quiet. Natalie set down her pen. "He built parallel infrastructure," she said, "right next to Adrian's." Carol was already looking at Torres's screen. "Same logistics sector. Similar enough," Torres said. "Freight handling, cold storage, distribution capacity. If Vail Meridian ever had a supply chain disruption, these properties could absorb the contracts in under 2 weeks." The implications settled over the room slowly, the way cold air settles, and then all at once. Gavin Rourke had not simply stolen $12 million from Adrian Vale. He had been using that money to build a competing operation positioned close enough to Vale Meridian to absorb its business the moment Adrian's empire weakened. He had been spending 12 years creating the conditions for that weakness, while simultaneously positioning himself to profit from the collapse. Carol looked at Natalie. "How long have you known about the properties?" she asked. "I found the first property transfer 8 months ago," Natalie said. "I didn't understand what it was connected to until I found the Delaware company last month. When I saw how they were positioned relative to Adrian's facilities," she paused. "I knew then that this wasn't just theft, this was a replacement." Carol sat back. "He was going to take the whole operation," Carol said. It wasn't a question. "I was going to let it fall," Natalie said, "and then pick up the pieces, the legitimate pieces, the parts that could survive without the criminal infrastructure, the parts that could be rebranded and refinanced and operated cleanly because they'd have been purchased at collapse pricing from an organization that appeared to have imploded on its own." Silence. "And Adrian would have looked like the reason it fell," Carol said. "Adrian would have been the reason it fell," Natalie said quietly. "Because Gavin has spent 12 years making sure that Adrian's decisions looked like his own when they worked and looked like failure when they didn't. Every bad deal Adrian ever walked into, Gavin had a hand in steering him toward. Every good deal that could have cleaned the organization up." She stopped. "Those are the ones Gavin advised against." Carol closed her notebook. She looked at Natalie with an expression that was not quite admiration, but was the professional equivalent of it, the recognition of someone who has done serious, difficult, dangerous work under conditions that most people would not have survived intact. "You built this entire documentation structure," Carol said, "while living inside his house." "While running his legitimate businesses," Natalie said. "Yes." Carol nodded once. "All right," she said. "We're going to need everything. Every document, every email chain, every notation in this ledger verified against independent source records. I'm going to have my team work in parallel tracks: corporate filings, banking records, property transfers, and the authorization code trail." She paused. "We'll need 48 hours minimum." "You have 36?" Natalie said. "Because Gavin already knows the auditors are moving." Carol looked at her. "He knows." "Adrian confronted him yesterday afternoon," Natalie said. "Gavin walked out, which means he spent last night making calls." Carol turned to Torres. "What's our fastest verification path on the authorization codes?" "Banking metadata," Torres said without hesitation. "If the codes were used to authorize electronic transfers, the timestamp and IP data from the bank's servers will tell us whether Adrian was physically present to authorize them. If he wasn't in the building and the code was still used..." "It wasn't him," Carol finished. "Get me a subpoena request drafted by noon." She stood up. "We're moving right now." She extended her hand to Natalie across the table. Natalie shook it. "You should know," Carol said, "that this is going to get significantly more complicated before it gets cleaner. When we start pulling these records, there are going to be people who push back hard." "I know," Natalie said, "including possibly people who've been protecting Gavin inside Adrian's organization." "I know that too." Carol studied her for a moment. "Are you prepared for that?" Natalie looked back at her steadily. "I've been prepared for the last 6 months," she said. "I've just been waiting for everyone else to catch up." Carol almost smiled. Then she gathered her files and walked out with her team behind her, already on her phone before she cleared the doorway. Rachel, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table throughout the entire meeting, looked at Natalie. "You realize," Rachel said, "that you just handed the investigation a 48-hour head start that Adrian's own attorneys couldn't have given them." "Yes," Natalie said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. You could have sat on this information. Let Gavin and Adrian fight it out. Whatever fell, fell." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "Adrian didn't build that empire alone," she said finally. "I know what he is. I know what he's done. I know who he's been. But I also know that 12 years of my life went into keeping the legitimate side of that company alive. The people who work there, the drivers, the warehouse managers, the logistics coordinators, they didn't choose to work for a man with complicated affiliations. They chose a job." She paused. "Gavin's plan destroys all of it. Every legitimate job, every clean contract, every honest dollar that company makes. And he does it on purpose for profit. I won't let that happen because I'm angry at Adrian." Rachel looked at her for a long moment. "You're a better person than most people in your position would be," Rachel said. "I'm a forensic accountant," Natalie said. "I follow the money and I protect the things worth protecting." She closed the ledger. "That's all I've ever done." She didn't say that protecting things worth protecting had cost her more than she had ever planned to spend. She didn't need to. Rachel had been her friend for 20 years and understood it without the words. At 11:15 a.m., Gavin Rourke held a meeting of his own. Adrian did not know about this meeting until Cole told him at 12:30, having received the information from Braddock, who had heard it from an associate who had been in the building and was loyal enough or frightened enough to pass it along. Gavin had called together 6 of the most senior figures in Adrian's organization. Not Vale Meridian executives, the other side. The men who handled the parts of the empire that didn't appear in any corporate filing, who reported ultimately to Adrian, but whose daily operations had been managed for the last decade, largely through Gavin's guidance. Gavin had told them 3 things. First, that Adrian was in crisis, following the breakdown of his marriage, and was making impulsive, emotionally driven decisions. Second, that his wife had removed sensitive organizational documents and was currently using them in what amounted to a hostile action against the organization. Third, that the appropriate response was to remove the documents from Natalie's possession immediately and return stability to the organization's leadership structure. 2 of the 6 men had walked out of the meeting. 4 had not. Cole delivered this information to Adrian at 12:30 p.m. in the Vale Meridian boardroom. He laid it out cleanly without dramatic elaboration, the way Cole had always communicated bad news directly, completely without softening it in ways that would slow down Adrian's ability to respond to it. Adrian listened without moving. When Cole finished, Adrian said one word. "Braddock." Cole nodded. Braddock had been in contact. Braddock had not attended Gavin's meeting. Braddock had spent 30 years inside this organization and had watched Adrian grow up and had made a quiet, private decision somewhere in the last 18 hours about which side of this he was prepared to stand on. "He'll hold the 4, Cole said. "He thinks. They're hesitating because Gavin's argument sounds reasonable on the surface, but it doesn't explain the financial evidence, and 2 of them are smart enough to understand that the financial evidence is the thing that actually matters." "It sounds reasonable because he designed it to," Adrian said. "He's framing Natalie as the threat because as long as they're looking at her, they're not looking at him." "Yeah." Adrian stood up. He moved to the window, the same window he had stood at yesterday afternoon when everything was already in motion, and he hadn't yet understood the full shape of it. "He's going to move against her," Adrian said. "He's going to try," Cole said carefully. "Within the next 24 hours, before the investigators establish an independent record, before the attorneys file. He needs to get that ledger back, and he needs Natalie discredited as a source, and he needs to do both of those things before Carol Freed's team verifies the banking metadata." Adrian turned from the window. "Cole, nobody gets near her. I don't mean surveillance, I mean protection, real protection. I want 2 of our best people outside Rachel Monroe's building right now, and I want them there until this is over, and I want Natalie to know they're there, not because I'm trying to control her, but because Gavin has 4 men who haven't made up their minds yet, and I am not willing to find out what that means." Cole was already on his phone. "She's not going to like it," Cole said. "She doesn't have to like it," Adrian said. "She has to be safe." Cole stepped out to make the call. Adrian stood alone in the boardroom with the Chicago skyline behind him and the quiet of a building that had been running on tension for 36 hours, and he thought about Gavin sitting across from 6 men and framing Natalie Vale as the problem in a crisis that Gavin himself had engineered. Something moved through Adrian's chest that was not quite the rage he had built his reputation on. It was colder than that, more deliberate. The specific, controlled fury of a man who understands exactly what has been done to him and to the people around him and has decided precisely how he intends to respond. He picked up his phone and called a number that he rarely called directly. The call was answered on the 3rd ring. "I need a meeting," Adrian said. "Today, not at Meridian and not at the estate, somewhere neutral." He listened. "Yes, I understand what I'm asking. I'll be there." He paused. "And tell whoever needs to know that Gavin Rourke no longer speaks for this organization. Effective immediately." He hung up. Cole came back in. "Done. 2 people outside Rachel's building as of 20 minutes ago. Rachel has been notified." "And Natalie?" Cole hesitated. Natalie said, and I'm quoting directly, that she appreciates the concern, and she'll consider the arrangement as long as your people understand they work for her safety and not for your peace of mind. Despite everything, something moved briefly across Adrian's face that almost resembled the man he used to be before the weight of the last 48 hours had finished rearranging him. "Fair enough," he said. At 1 p.m., Carol Freed called Natalie directly. "The banking metadata," Carol said without preamble. "We have preliminary results." Natalie sat forward. "How many, Mo?" 47 transactions over a 38-month period. Adrian Vale's authorization code was used to approve all 47. Carol paused. In 29 of those transactions, Adrian was physically documented as being in a different location at the time of authorization. Different city in 11 cases. Different country in 3. Natalie closed her eyes for a moment. "I was never there," she said. "He was never there," Carol confirmed. "The code was used remotely, through a secure access protocol that only 3 people had credentials for." "Gavin had the credentials." "Gavin had the credentials," Carol said. "We can place him on the network during 14 of the 29 incidents already. We're still working on the remaining 15, but at this point the pattern is established." Natalie opened her eyes. She looked at Rachel, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand the direction. "Carol," Natalie said, "the filing. How fast?" "We can have a preliminary report ready for the federal compliance team by end of business today, if I push my team." "Push your team? It'll cost whatever it costs," Natalie said. "Push your team." Carol hung up. Rachel was already looking at her. "This is going to become a federal matter." "Yes," Natalie said. "That changes the scope significantly." "Yes." Adrian could be implicated in the transactions even with exculpatory evidence because his code was used and proving he didn't authorize it requires, which is exactly why the banking metadata has to be filed before Gavin can establish an alternative narrative, Natalie said. "If we let Gavin frame this first, the authorization code trail becomes evidence against Adrian instead of evidence against Gavin. And then Adrian spends the next 3 years in federal litigation instead of rebuilding his company." Rachel stared at her. "You're protecting him," Rachel said quietly. "Still." Natalie met her friend's eyes. "I'm protecting the truth," she said. "The truth happens to include the fact that Adrian didn't do this." The room held that distinction carefully between them. At 2:45 p.m., Gavin Rourke made his first direct move. He called Vale Meridian's primary bank, the institution that handled the majority of the company's legitimate corporate accounts, and requested an emergency meeting with the senior relationship manager. He did not identify himself as a former advisor or a person under investigation. He identified himself with complete technical accuracy as an authorized signatory on several Vale Meridian accounts, a designation that had never been formally revoked because Adrian had not yet moved through the legal process of removing it. The bank's relationship manager, a cautious woman named Patricia Sohn, who had handled the Vale Meridian accounts for 7 years, accepted the meeting because she had no grounds yet to refuse it. Braddock found out about the meeting at 3:15 and called Cole. Cole called Adrian at 3:17. Adrian called Patricia Sohn's direct line at 3:20. "Patricia," he said, "you have a meeting scheduled this afternoon with Gavin Rourke." A pause. "Mr. Vale, cancel it." "Mr. Vale, Mr. Rourke is a listed signatory. He is under active investigation by an independent corporate audit team," Adrian said, "and I am formally notifying you right now on a recorded line that any action taken in connection with Vale Meridian accounts as a result of that meeting will be subject to legal review. Cancel the meeting and flag this call for your compliance department." He paused. "Please." The please was not something Patricia Sohn had ever heard from Adrian Vale before. It landed in the conversation with the small, significant weight of a word that meant more than its single syllable. "I'll make the call," Patricia said. "Thank you." He hung up. Cole looked at him. "That was close." "He's testing every access point he still has," Adrian said. "He's looking for something he can lock before the investigators get there. If he freezes the right accounts or transfers the authorization on even one of the key holdings he creates, enough legal ambiguity to buy himself time. We need to move faster than he can." "We are moving faster," Adrian said. "We just don't feel like it yet." At 4:30 p.m., Carol Freed's preliminary report was delivered electronically to the federal compliance filing system. Simultaneously, a copy went to Vale Meridian's corporate attorneys. Simultaneously, a summary went to the Independent Oversight Committee of Vale Meridian's board. Carol had pushed her team hard enough that 2 of her associates had been working without lunch, but the document that resulted was 63 pages of precisely organized, independently verified financial evidence with source citations, banking metadata references, corporate registration chains, and a timeline that laid out 38 months of fraudulent activity with the clean, irrefutable clarity of forensic accounting done at its absolute best. Natalie's original ledger was referenced as the source document on page 1. Her name was at the top of the acknowledgement section. Carol called her when the filing was confirmed. "It's in," Carol said. Natalie exhaled. "He's going to know within the hour," Carol said, "the moment his attorneys pick up any signal from the compliance system." "I know," Natalie said. "That's fine, let him know." Carol paused. "Are you all right?" "I've been building toward this document for 6 months," Natalie said. "I'm better than all right." At 5 p.m., Adrian received a copy of the preliminary filing from his attorneys. He sat in his boardroom and read every page, not a summary, not an executive briefing, every page, every footnote, every carefully cited source. He read his wife's name at the top of the acknowledgement section and sat with it for a moment. Then he called Cole into the room. "She filed it," Adrian said. Cole sat down. "The federal compliance report. She pushed Carol Freed's team to file before end of business today. Before Gavin could reach the bank, before he could establish an alternative narrative, before his attorneys could create a legal buffer around any of the access points he still has." Adrian set the report on the desk. "She did it to protect the record, to protect the integrity of the evidence, and—" He stopped. "And," Cole said. "And to protect me," Adrian said, "from being implicated in transactions that carried my authorization code. She could have let that ambiguity stand. It would have created significant legal problems for me and very little additional legal problems for her. She chose to file the banking metadata that exonerates me at the same time it implicates Gavin." He looked at Cole. "She didn't have to do that." Cole was quiet for a moment. "She told Rachel she was protecting the truth," Cole said. "She was protecting me," Adrian said. "She just described it differently because she knew if she called it protection, I'd feel like I owed her something, and she doesn't want me to feel like I owe her anything." He paused. "That's exactly how she thinks." Cole looked at his brother. "You know her better than you've acted for the last several years," Cole said. The observation was quiet, but it found its mark. Adrian nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He had spent 36 hours peeling back 12 years of comfortable certainty and finding underneath it the uncomfortable truth that he had taken the most capable person in his world and treated her as a function rather than a person. And the clearest evidence of that was not the anniversary dinner, was not. Vanessa was not even the public humiliation that Natalie had endured without flinching. The clearest evidence was the 3 emails, sitting in his inbox, unread. At 6:15 p.m., Gavin Rourke did something unexpected. He called Adrian directly. Adrian answered. "You filed the compliance report," Gavin said. His voice was different, not warm, not performing warmth, something stripped down and specific, the voice of a man speaking to another man without the comfortable fiction of affection between them. "My wife filed it," Adrian said. "I supported it." A pause. "Your wife has no idea what she's done." "My wife," Adrian said, "has a better idea of what she's done than anyone else in this situation, including you." Adrian, Gavin's voice shifted, found something that sounded almost like the old warmth, the practiced almost uncle concern. "You're making a decision based on emotion, based on a marriage that's falling apart, and a woman who took documents she wasn't entitled to. She built those documents," Adrian said. "She built them inside your organization using your resources, which makes them—" "Gavin." Adrian's voice was very quiet, the specific quiet. "I read her emails, all 3 of them. I read what she found 14 months ago. I read what she found 8 months ago. I read the email I never opened that she sent 6 months ago with Bernard Holt's name and a footnote." He paused. "I read all of it. And then I read 63 pages of independent verification. So I need you to understand that I am not making a decision based on emotion. I am making a decision based on 38 months of banking metadata that places your credential on 47 fraudulent transactions." He let that sit for a moment. "We're done having this conversation." Gavin was quiet for 3 full seconds. Your father would be disappointed, he said finally. My father, Adrian said, didn't know what you were. He hung up. He set the phone on the table. Cole was watching him from across the room. He mentioned Dad, Cole said. Yes. That's a pressure point he's going to use again. He can use it as many times as he wants, Adrian said. It doesn't change the banking metadata. But even as he said it, something was working underneath the surface of his composure, something that had been working since the moment Cole had first connected Gavin's name to the period surrounding Victor Vale's final year, something that the 63 pages of Carol Freed's preliminary report had touched on in its earliest sections, in a passage that described unusual corporate authority transfers occurring in a window of time that predated Victor's official medical incapacitation. Adrian picked up his phone again. He called Carol Freed. The authority transfers in the early sections, he said when she answered. The ones from the period before my father's official incapacitation. Carol was quiet for a moment. We flagged those as requiring additional investigation, she said carefully. I need to know, Adrian said, exactly what was transferred, and when, and what the medical records from that period say about my father's actual condition at the time the transfers were made. A pause. Carol's voice, when it came back, was measured in the specific way of someone choosing words deliberately. Adrian, that investigation is going to go somewhere that may be very difficult to come back from. I know, he said. It may change the legal structure of your own inheritance. I know that too. And the findings may not be, she paused, what you're hoping for, or what you're fearing. They may be something in between that's harder to live with than either. Carol, Adrian said. My wife spent 12 years in my house watching things happen that I refused to see. She documented it and tried to tell me, and I dismissed her every time. He paused. I am done dismissing things because they're difficult to see. Carol was quiet for a moment. I'll have my team open the secondary investigation tonight, she said. Thank you. He hung up. The boardroom was quiet. Cole sat at the table. Adrian stood by the window. The city moved below them, indifferent and enormous, doing what cities do when private lives crack open inside tall buildings. What do you think you're going to find? Cole asked. It was a real question, no agenda, just a younger brother asking because he needed to know whether he was prepared for the answer. Adrian thought about Gavin's last words. Your father would be disappointed. He thought about the practiced ease of that sentence, how quickly it had arrived, how perfectly deployed it was, the kind of sentence a man uses when he knows the pressure points of the person he's talking to, with the intimacy of someone who helped create them. He thought about Victor Vale in his final year. The declining health that everyone had attributed to age and stress. The accelerated transfer of authority that Gavin had framed at the time as responsible succession planning. The careful positioning of Adrian as the face of the organization before Victor's condition had been formally assessed. He thought about Natalie's word, manufactured. I think, Adrian said slowly, that I'm going to find out my father was removed from his own empire before he died. And I think I'm going to find out that the man I trusted most in the world spent the last 12 years making sure I never looked closely enough at how it happened. He looked out at the city. And I think Natalie found the beginning of that evidence 6 months ago and tried to tell me, and I left it unopened in my inbox. He paused. So whatever I find, I'm the one who chose not to look when I still had time. Cole didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say to that. At 8 p.m., Natalie received a call from Carol Freed. I need to tell you something, Carol said, and I need you to hear it before you see it in the documentation. Natalie sat very still. We opened the secondary investigation into the authority transfers, Carol said. The period surrounding Victor Vale's final year. And, Carol took a brief breath, the medical records from that period which we accessed through the compliance subpoena indicate that Victor Vale's condition was significantly more serious and significantly earlier in its progression than was publicly known. She paused. But the corporate authority transfers, which reduced his legal decision-making power over the company's most important holdings, were made 6 weeks before his condition met the medical threshold that would have legally triggered an automatic review of his capacity. Natalie understood immediately. Gavin moved 6 weeks early, she said. The transfers were made when Victor was sick enough to be manipulated, Carol said carefully, but not yet sick enough that the transfers would automatically be subject to legal scrutiny. It's a window, a very specific window, and someone who understood both the medical timeline and the legal thresholds would have known exactly how wide that window was. The silence stretched. Victor Vale signed those transfers himself, Carol said. We have the signatures. He was present. But whether he fully understood what he was signing and the condition he was in at that time. She stopped. That's the question, Natalie said. That's the question. Natalie pressed her hand flat on the table in front of her. She thought about Adrian, about the man sitting across the city in his boardroom, reading Carol's 63 pages, and finally letting himself see what she had spent 6 months trying to show him. She thought about what this information would do to him, not to his legal position, not to the man she had once believed in completely before years of being invisible and dismissed had finally exhausted that belief. She thought about a son who had built his identity on inheriting his father's world, discovering that the world he inherited had already been taken before it was given to him. Carol, she said, yes. Is the evidence solid enough to establish what happened? Solid enough for the investigators to pursue it seriously, Carol said. Not conclusive enough yet for a definitive legal finding. We'd need additional documentation. Natalie opened the Atlas Ledger to its oldest section. The entries she had almost not included because they were old and partial, and she had told herself they might be irrelevant. The entries she had ultimately included because 12 years of forensic instinct had told her that in financial evidence, nothing that points in the same direction is ever truly irrelevant. I have correspondence, Natalie said. Partial, from the period you're describing. I flagged it in the ledger because some of the language was unusual references to timing, to windows, to a transition schedule that didn't match the official succession timeline. She paused. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at when I documented it. I think I do now. She heard Carol writing. Can you get it to me tonight? Carol asked. Yes, Natalie said. She hung up. She sat alone in the quiet of the condominium with the ledger open in front of her, and she thought about the night she had first built it, the months of careful documentation, the forensic patience, the sense that she was building something important, whose full shape she couldn't yet see. She had built it to protect Adrian. She had built it to create a record of separation between what was clean and what was not, to give him the evidence he would someday need to stand on solid ground. She had not known when she started that the most important thing it would eventually reveal was not what Adrian had done, but what had been done to him. She closed the ledger. She thought about the sentence she had spoken at the anniversary table 2 nights ago that had felt at the time like an ending. I won't fight for you anymore. She had meant it completely. She still meant it. She would not fight for Adrian Vale the way she had fought for 12 years, quietly, invisibly absorbing consequences that were never hers to absorb, making herself smaller so that his world had room to believe it was entirely his. But standing outside a fight was not the same as abandoning the truth inside it. Natalie Vale was not fighting for Adrian. She was fighting for the record, and the record built over 12 years with forensic patience and the kind of love that had eventually asked to be seen and hadn't been, was about to do something that no amount of Gavin Rourke's careful maneuvering could prevent. It was about to tell the whole truth, about everything. The correspondence Natalie sent to Carol Freed at 9:40 p.m. arrived as 17 scanned documents, each one carefully flagged with a reference number corresponding to the relevant ledger entry. Carol's team worked through the night. By 2 a.m., Torres had cross-referenced 11 of the 17 documents against independent corporate filings from the same period, and confirmed that the language in Gavin's private communications matched with specific precision. The timing of corporate authority transfers that had moved key decision-making power away from Victor Vale in the weeks before his condition became legally significant. By 3 a.m., Carol called her contact at the Federal Compliance Office directly. By 4 a.m., the secondary investigation was formally opened. Adrian didn't sleep that night either. Cole had gone home at midnight after Adrian spent 40 minutes telling him to leave, that he was fine, that he didn't need company, that Cole had his own family and his own life, and the situation was as contained as it was going to be until morning brought whatever morning was going to bring. Cole had eventually left with the particular reluctance of a younger brother who doesn't believe the older one is fine, but has learned across a lifetime of watching that certain men need to be alone with the things they've discovered. Adrian sat in his study, not working, not reviewing documents, not making calls, just sitting. He was thinking about his father. Victor Vale had been a difficult man to love and an impossible man to argue with, which was something Adrian had always understood as simply the nature of strong men, that strength expressed itself in control, in the expectation of deference, in the particular silence that fell over rooms when Victor walked into them. Adrian had grown up believing that was power. He had spent his adult life replicating it, refining it, building his own version of it. He sat now in the silence of his study and thought about the last year of his father's life, the health decline that had seemed sudden from the outside, but which Gavin had quietly managed from close up, controlling the flow of medical information to the family, framing the pace of the succession as Victor's own carefully considered decision, positioning Adrian as the chosen heir with a warmth and certainty that had felt at the time like loyalty. He thought about Victor signing documents he may not have fully understood in a room where the only other person present was a man who had spent 30 years earning the right to be trusted without question. He thought about the word Natalie had used, manufactured. She had found the beginning of this 6 months ago. She had put Bernard Holt's name in a footnote and labeled it as something that mattered and sent it to him, and he had left it unread. Because he was busy, because he trusted Gavin, because it was easier to believe that his wife was paranoid and his consigliere was loyal than to sit with the alternative. The alternative was sitting with him now. At 5:15 a.m., his phone buzzed with a message from Cole. 4 words Gavin filed for injunction. Adrian read it. He set the phone down. He picked it up again and called his lead attorney, a sharp-edged woman named Diana Marsh, who had been handling Vale Meridian's legal affairs for 9 years, and who answered her phone at 5:15 in the morning with the focused calm of someone who had been awake for hours. "I saw it," Diana said before he could speak. "He's arguing that the compliance report is based on documents improperly removed from Vale Meridian property by a party in an active separation proceeding. He wants the report suspended pending a determination of whether the ledger constitutes organizational property." "Does he have grounds?" Adrian asked. "Technically narrow ones," Diana said, "but a sympathetic judge could give him a 48-hour suspension, which is all he needs to move the remaining assets through the Nevada company before the investigators can freeze them." "How do we stop it?" "We need to establish that the ledger was Natalie's independent work product," Diana said, "not created at organizational direction, not maintained on organizational systems, not stored in organizational custody. If we can demonstrate that the improperly removed property argument collapses." "She built it on her own systems," Adrian said. "At home, she has always maintained it independently. Can she demonstrate that?" "She can demonstrate anything," Adrian said. And then, because it was 5:15 in the morning and he was past the point of performing certainty about things he wasn't certain of, he added, "She's the most thorough person I have ever met. If she built something, she documented how she built it." "I need her affidavit by 9 a.m., Diana said. "If we can file a counter-response before the injunction hearing, we have a strong chance of getting it denied. I'll reach out through Rachel Monroe." He called Rachel at 5:20. Rachel answered on the second ring, which meant Rachel had also not been sleeping. "I know about the injunction," Rachel said immediately. "Gavin's attorneys filed copies with us simultaneously. They're being thorough." "We need Natalie's affidavit about the ledger's origins," Adrian said, "by 9 a.m. "Adrian." "Rachel, I know I don't have the right to ask her for anything. I know that. But this isn't about our marriage. This is about whether Gavin Rourke spends the next 48 hours moving $12 million of stolen money through a corporate structure that Natalie spent 6 months documenting. If that injunction succeeds, all of her work disappears into a legal dispute that could take years to resolve." He paused. "Please ask her." A silence on the line. "I'll ask," Rachel said. "She'll decide." He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, and then he put it down on the desk, and he thought about what it meant to ask something of a person you had spent 12 years not properly asking, the difference between demanding and requesting, the distance between treating someone as a resource and treating them as a person with the complete right to say no. Natalie said yes. Rachel called back at 5:47. "She'll have the affidavit to Diana Marsh by 8:30, Rachel said. "She says she already has the documentation of the ledger's independent origins because she anticipated this argument 3 months ago." Of course she did. Of course she had. Adrian exhaled. "Tell her thank you," he said. "Tell her yourself," Rachel said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "At some point, Adrian, you're going to need to tell her things yourself." He didn't argue. By 8:15 a.m. Natalie's affidavit was complete. It was 11 pages meticulously organized with supporting documentation that established the ledger's independent origins through digital metadata from her personal laptop purchase records for the secure storage system she had used, and the professional correspondence with Rachel Monroe dating back to the period when she had first started building the document. It answered Gavin's argument so thoroughly, so specifically, and so completely that when Diana Marsh read it at 8:40, she called Adrian and said simply, "Whoever your wife's attorney recommended as a forensic documentation source, the work is immaculate." "She did it herself," Adrian said. A brief pause on Diana's end. "Of course she did," Diana said. The injunction hearing happened at 10:30 a.m. in front of a federal magistrate who had a reputation for impatience with tactical legal maneuvers and a particular dislike of bad faith filings. Gavin's attorneys presented their argument for the suspension with confident precision. Diana Marsh presented Natalie's affidavit and supporting documentation in response. The magistrate took 11 minutes to deny the injunction. Gavin's attorneys filed an immediate appeal. The appeal was denied 40 minutes later. Cole was outside the courthouse when Diana called with the result. He called Adrian immediately. "It's denied," Cole said. "Both attempts." Adrian was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "The asset freeze," he asked. "The investigators have already moved on the Nevada properties," Cole said. "All four. The Delaware holding company is frozen pending the full investigation. Bernard Holt's legal practice is under review." He paused. "Adrian, it's over for Gavin. He has nowhere left to move." Adrian sat down. The sensation that moved through him was not triumph. He had expected something that resembled triumph, the particular satisfaction of a powerful man who has defeated a threat. What he actually felt was something considerably quieter and considerably harder to name. Something that had to do with the distance between what he had believed for 12 years and what was now documented in 63 pages of federal compliance filing and 11 pages of his wife's affidavit. Something that had to do with the cost. "Cole," he said. "Yeah." "Set up the meeting with the board's independent oversight committee, today if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest." "What are you going to tell them?" "Everything," Adrian said. "Everything Carol Freed found. Everything about Gavin. Everything about the organization's structure and the changes that need to happen for Vail Meridian to survive this as a legitimate company." He paused. "No more selective disclosure. No more managing information so people only see what I want them to see." Another pause. "That's Gavin's playbook. I'm done with it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a very uncomfortable meeting," Cole said. "Good," Adrian said. "Uncomfortable meetings are what happens when you've been avoiding them for 12 years. At 12:45 p.m., Gavin Rourke was formally removed from every position, title, and advisory role connected to Vail Meridian and its subsidiaries. The removal was documented, witnessed, and filed simultaneously with the independent investigators, the Board Oversight Committee, and Vail Meridian's corporate attorneys. It was thorough in the way that only happens when the person doing the removing has decided there will be no ambiguity, no gray area, no interpretable middle ground. Braddock called Adrian at 1 p.m. to report that the four men who had attended Gavin's meeting the previous morning had all independently and within the same 2-hour window contacted their own legal counsel and indicated a willingness to cooperate with investigators. "Fear is a great motivator," Braddock said. "So is watching the other option disappear," Adrian said. At 2 p.m. Evelyn Vail called. Adrian answered on the first ring, which was unusual. He almost never answered his mother on the first ring. Not because he didn't love her, but because Evelyn Vail asked questions that required his full attention, and he had spent years not having full attention to give her. "I heard about Gavin," Evelyn said. "Yes. Tell me what you know about your father." The question landed without softening, without preamble, without the protective layers most people would have wrapped around something that sensitive. Evelyn Vale had survived longer than anyone Adrian knew and had spent the last decade watching her son run the empire that had been built before him, and she asked her question the way women who have outlived their own certainties tend to ask difficult questions directly because they have learned that indirection costs time that isn't always available. Adrian told her everything Carol had found, the authority transfers, the window, the possibility that Victor had signed documents during a period of compromised capacity while the only other person in the room was Gavin Rourke. Evelyn was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was completely controlled in the specific way of a woman who has decided not to cry in front of anyone, including herself. "I knew something was wrong in that last year," she said. "The decisions Victor was making, the pace of the transition. I told your father once that it felt rushed, and he said—" She stopped. He said Gavin had advised that moving quickly was the responsible approach, that it protected the family. A pause. "I believed it. I believed him. Mom." "Adrian, I need you to find out what happened to your father. Not for the investigation, not for the legal case." Her voice steadied. "For him. He deserves to have the truth on the record." "I know," Adrian said. "Carol's team is already working on the secondary investigation." "And Natalie?" Evelyn said. The name arrived quietly in the conversation. "What about Natalie?" Adrian asked. "She found this," Evelyn said. "She found all of it, and she tried to tell you. She was in my home at that anniversary dinner, and you—" She stopped herself. "I have not called you to say what you already know you did. I'm calling to tell you that whatever happens between you and your wife is your own matter, and I will not insert myself into it." A pause. "But that woman has never been anything but loyal to this family, including to your father's memory. And I want you to understand that I understand that even if it took me longer than it should have to say so out loud." Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you, Mom," he said. He meant it more completely than he had meant almost anything in recent memory. At 3:30 p.m., Adrian walked into Vale Meridian's main building for the first time since the board meeting and did something he had never done in 12 years of running the company. He walked through the logistics operations floor, not as an inspection, not as a performance of authority. He just walked through past the coordinators and the data analysts and the administrative staff who looked up from their desks with the particular surprised attention of people who are accustomed to seeing their employer only in controlled, formal contexts. He stopped at the desk of a woman named Linda, who had been Vale Meridian's senior logistics coordinator for 9 years, and who had the specific, exhausted competence of someone who actually keeps an organization running while everyone above her has meetings about it. "Linda," he said. She looked at him cautiously. "Mr. Vale, how long have you been aware that something was wrong with the expansion accounts?" he asked. Linda looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "Which aspect of what was wrong are you asking about?" He almost smiled. "All of it," he said. Linda folded her hands on her desk. "About a year and a half," she said. "Maybe longer. There were vendor payments that didn't match our contracted rates. Facilities costs for locations I'd never received operational reports from. I raised it with Gavin's office twice." She paused. "I was told it was being handled at the executive level." "It was being handled," Adrian said. "Just not the way you were told." He looked at her steadily. "From this point forward, anything that looks wrong to you comes directly to me, or to the independent audit team. Nobody else. Can you do that?" Linda looked at him with the expression of someone reassessing a person they thought they had already fully assessed. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He moved on. He spent 45 minutes on the operations floor. He talked to 7 people. He asked real questions and received real answers from people who had been doing real work inside an organization whose complexity they understood better than most of the executives above them. He learned things he should have learned years ago about operational inefficiencies. Gavin had deliberately preserved because the confusion made monitoring difficult about vendor relationships that had been structured in ways that benefited subsidiaries nobody on the floor had recognized as connected to the company. He walked back upstairs to his office, carrying the weight of those 45 minutes like something newly acquired and not yet comfortable. Cole was waiting. "The board oversight committee can meet tomorrow at 9 a.m., Cole said. "Confirm it. Diana wants to prep you tonight. Tell her 6 p.m., my office." Cole made notes. "Braddock says the 4 men are all fully cooperative as of an hour ago. Their attorneys have established formal cooperation agreements with the investigators. Good. And, Cole paused. Vanessa Cross called. Adrian looked at him. She wants to apologize, Cole said carefully. Apparently she didn't know the full scope of Cole. Adrian's voice was not unkind. I don't need Vanessa Cross's apology. I need her formal resignation letter from the expansion director position she never actually assumed filed with HR by end of business today. If she wants to apologize to anyone, she should consider apologizing to the woman whose position she was handed. Cole nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. At 5 p.m., something happened that nobody had anticipated. Bernard Holt surrendered. Not dramatically. Not in a way that involved law enforcement or courthouse steps or any of the visible machinery of legal consequence. Bernard Holt, 71 years old, the private attorney who had handled Victor Vale's affairs in his final years and whose name had appeared twice where it shouldn't have appeared, called the Federal Compliance Office through his own attorney and indicated his willingness to provide a complete voluntary accounting of his role in the authority transfer process. Torres called Carol. Carol called Natalie. Natalie called Rachel. He's going to talk, Rachel said the moment Natalie picked up. Natalie sat very still. About the transfers, she asked. About everything, Rachel said. His attorney indicated he has documentation going back to the period before Victor's first diagnosis. Full correspondence with Gavin. The complete picture of how the succession window was identified and used. She paused. Natalie, he has letters, in Victor Vale's own handwriting, written during the period when the transfers were being made. Natalie put her hand flat on the table. What do the letters say? She asked quietly. We don't know the content yet, Rachel said, but Bernard Holt has held these letters for 12 years. He's held them because Gavin told him they were insurance. And now that Gavin's position has completely collapsed, Bernard Holt has decided that 12 years of holding someone else's insurance policy is long enough. The room was very quiet. Natalie thought about Victor Vale, whom she had met only twice, once before the marriage and once at a family dinner 2 years before his death. She remembered him as a man with an enormous physical presence that had clearly diminished significantly by the time she met him, and eyes that were still precise and watchful in a face that had grown tired. She had liked him in the brief and distant way you like someone whose full person you've only glimpsed. She had thought both times that he seemed like a man carrying something heavy. Now she thought she might understand what it was. Rachel, she said, Adrian needs to know about this before it becomes public. Rachel paused. Natalie, you don't have to be the one who tells him. I know, she said, but he should hear it from someone who... She stopped. She started again. He should hear it from someone who understands what it means, not from an attorney giving him a legal briefing, from someone who knows what it means to find out that the person you trusted most was the person who was lying to you the longest. Rachel was quiet for a moment. You want me to arrange a meeting, she said. I want you to ask him if he's willing to meet, Natalie said. There's a difference. Adrian's answer came back within 8 minutes. Yes, wherever she wanted, whenever she wanted. They met at 6 p.m. in a conference room at Rachel's office, neutral ground, chosen deliberately, the only kind of ground they could both stand on right now. Not his house, not her condominium, not any location that belonged to either of them. Adrian arrived first and was already sitting when Natalie walked in. He stood when she entered, not as performance, not as the practiced social reflex of a powerful man in public rooms, but as something simpler and considerably less certain. The instinct of a person who is aware that they owe someone an acknowledgement they don't fully know how to give. Natalie looked at him. He looked different. She had noticed it in the quality of his messages through Rachel in the words Cole had relayed, but seeing it in person was different. He looked like a man who had been in a building when the architecture shifted and had stayed in the building instead of running and was now standing in the aftermath of that decision. Less polished, more present. Something in his eyes that she recognized because she had been waiting 12 years to see it. The willingness to look at something directly without first deciding what he was going to do about it. Thank you for coming, he said. Sit down, Adrian, she said. He sat. She sat across from him. She placed the Atlas ledger on the table between them, not as a prop, not as a statement, just because it was what she was carrying, and it belonged on the table between them more than anywhere else. She told him about Bernard Holt. She told him slowly and completely, without softening it and without dramatizing it the way she had always delivered information with precision, and with the understanding that the person receiving it deserved its full weight rather than a managed version of it. She told him about the letters, about Victor's handwriting, about 12 years of documentation that Bernard Holt had been holding as insurance while Gavin Rourke built his replacement empire alongside the one he had helped steal. Adrian listened without moving. When she finished, the room was completely quiet. He pressed both hands flat on the table. His jaw worked once. He looked at the table rather than at her for approximately 30 seconds, the specific 30 seconds of a man who is deciding whether he is going to let himself feel the full extent of something or manage it into something smaller and safer. He did not manage it. "My father didn't choose this," he said. His voice was level, but the levelness was costing him something visible. "He didn't choose to hand the company to me. Gavin manufactured the handoff." "The evidence suggests that," Natalie said carefully, "Bernard Holt's full accounting will determine how much your father understood at the time of signing. It's possible he understood some of it and was coerced. It's possible he understood none of it. We won't know until we see the letters." "But Gavin knew," Adrian said. "Gavin knew exactly what my father understood and what he didn't. Gavin knew the medical timeline. Gavin knew the legal window. Gavin positioned me as the heir in front of my father, in front of everyone in a way that made it look like Victor's choice when it was his own design." He looked up from the table. "And then he spent 12 years standing next to me as my most trusted advisor, guiding me away from anyone who looked too closely at the foundation. Including Natalie." The word sat unspoken between them. "Including you," Adrian said. "He said it himself. Every time you raised questions about Gavin, every time you found something in the accounts that pointed toward him. I dismissed it because Gavin had spent 12 years making sure I would dismiss it. He told me you distrusted him because you wanted more control over my decisions, that your financial scrutiny was really about personal influence." He stopped. "I believed him, because it was easier to believe him than to believe that the man I called almost family had been running a 30-year deception." Natalie looked at him across the table. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. The two words arrived in the room without performance, without the smooth delivery of a man accustomed to managing impressions, without any of the careful framing that powerful people use to apologize without fully surrendering. They arrived simply the way truth arrives when a person has stopped being afraid of it. "I know you are," she said. "Natalie." "Adrian." Her voice was not cold. It was not angry. It was the voice of a woman who has done her crying privately and has come to this meeting clear-eyed because she understands that clarity is what the moment requires. "I need you to hear something." He waited. "For 12 years, she said. "I told myself that loving you meant standing between you and the consequences of the things you didn't see. I thought that was protection. I thought that was what love looked like when the person you love is carrying something heavier than they can hold by themselves." She paused. "But I was wrong. What I was actually doing was preventing you from ever having to hold it. And a person who never has to hold the weight of their own decisions doesn't grow. They just get better at leaning on whoever is holding it for them." Adrian didn't move. "You have been holding it for 3 days now," she said. "Without me. And look what you've done. You found the evidence. You engaged the investigators. You protected the record. You walked through your own operations floor and talked to your own people. You called your mother." She paused. "You did all of that yourself, not because I engineered it, not because I managed it from the background, because you finally had to." "Because you left," he said. "Because I stopped carrying it for you," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her across the ledger. "I understand that now," he said. The room held that understanding quietly. "The board meeting is tomorrow morning," Natalie said, shifting. "Carol's team will have additional documentation from Bernard Holt's voluntary accounting by then. Diana needs to know the scope before she walks into that room." "I know. I'm meeting with Diana at 6. "Good." She paused. "There are 3 sections of the ledger the board will need to see in their original form. I'll have copies prepared through Carol's office so the chain of custody is clean." "Natalie." He said her name the way a person says a name when they're about to ask something they don't have the right to ask and know it. "The divorce papers." She looked at him. "I received them this morning," he said. "From Rachel's office." "Yes." "I'm not going to fight them," he said. I'm not going to delay them, contest them, or use any of what's happening right now as leverage to complicate them. He held her gaze. I want you to know that. Whatever you need, whatever the settlement looks like, whatever timeline works for you, I will not make this harder than it already is. Something moved through Natalie's expression, not quite relief. Something more complicated the particular feeling of having braced for a fight that doesn't arrive. Thank you, she said. The estate, he said. The accounts. Anything from Vale Meridian that properly belongs to you for 12 years of work. I don't want Vale Meridian money, she said immediately. I never wanted it. I want what I earned independently and what the law says belongs to me from the marriage. That's all. That's not all, he said. Natalie, the work you did on the expansion division alone is work I did because I believed in the company, she said. Not as a transaction, not as an investment I expected a return on. I did it because I thought it mattered and I thought you mattered and I was trying to build something worth building. She paused. I don't want payment for that. I want it to have mattered. Those are different things. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. It mattered, he said. It always mattered. I just didn't say it. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who is receiving a truth she already knew and has already made her peace with. At 7 p.m., Natalie left Rachel's office and Adrian drove to Vale Meridian for his preparation session with Diana Marsh. They did not leave together. They did not make plans to speak again. They said goodbye in the hallway outside the conference room with the careful, honest distance of two people who have said the most important things and understand that more conversation tonight would only blur the clarity they had finally found. Diana Marsh met Adrian in the boardroom at 6:15 and spent 2 hours walking him through the next morning's board presentation. Adrian answered every question directly. He did not attempt to minimize, strategize, or control the narrative in the ways he had been controlling narratives for his entire adult life. He gave Diana the full picture and told her his goal was not to manage the board's reaction, but to give the board everything they needed to make informed decisions. Diana looked at him at one point and said, "You know this level of disclosure is going to create significant turbulence." "Yes," Adrian said. "Some of these board members are going to call for your resignation." "I know. You're prepared for that." Adrian thought about it. He thought about what it had cost to run this organization the way he had run it, the blindness he had cultivated, because it was more comfortable than seeing the loyalty he had trusted, because questioning it required acknowledging that he might have been wrong. The woman he had diminished because her competence threatened the story he told himself about his own. "I'm prepared to face whatever this board decides," he said. "I'm not prepared to face another 12 years of running this company the way I've been running it." Diana looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing I've ever heard you say." He smiled briefly. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who has arrived at honesty through the hardest possible route. "I had some help," he said. At 10 p.m. Cole came back to the boardroom with coffee and the quiet companionship of a brother who understood that his presence was the thing Adrian needed rather than more conversation. They sat together for a while without talking, and then Cole said, "How was she?" Adrian understood immediately who he meant. "Clear," he said. "She was completely clear." "That's Natalie." "Yeah," Adrian said. "That's Natalie." They sat with that for another moment. "She's going to be fine," Cole said. "Better than fine." "I know," Adrian said. And he did know. He knew it with the specific certainty of a person who has finally seen someone clearly enough to understand what they're capable of. Natalie Vale was going to build something of her own. She was going to take 12 years of forensic expertise and the particular hard-earned wisdom of a woman who has carried invisible weight and finally set it down, and she was going to do something with all of it that belonged entirely and completely to her. And he was not going to be part of it. And that was the right thing. And knowing it was the right thing did not make it easier to sit with, but it was the right thing nonetheless. At 11:15 p.m. Braddock called with a final update. "The Nevada properties are fully frozen," Braddock said. "The Delaware company is in receivership. Bernard Holt's attorney has confirmed that the voluntary accounting will be complete by 8 a.m. He paused. "Gavin Rourke's personal attorneys have indicated that he is exploring cooperation arrangements with the federal investigators." "He's going to try to negotiate," Adrian said. "He's going to try," Braddock said. "But Carol Freed's documentation is airtight, and Bernard Holt is a cooperating witness. There's not much left to negotiate with." Adrian nodded, though Braddock couldn't see it. "Braddock," he said, 30 years you've been in this organization. About that, Braddock said. Why didn't you go to Gavin's meeting? A pause. Because I've spent 30 years watching this family, and in 30 years the only person I ever saw who told the unvarnished truth about how things actually worked was your wife. Another pause. When she walked out of that dinner with the black case, I figured the truth was walking out with her, and I decided I'd rather stand on the side of the truth. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. Get some sleep, Braddock said. Tomorrow's going to be long. Adrian hung up. He sat in the empty boardroom at 11:30 p.m. with Chicago quiet outside and the Atlas Ledger sitting on the corner of the table where Natalie had left it. Not because she had forgotten it, but because she had left it deliberately, the way you leave something at someone's door when you want them to understand that it was always theirs to begin with, that you were only ever the person who kept it safe until they were ready to hold it properly. He reached across the table and pulled it toward him. He opened it to the first page. Natalie's handwriting was precise and clear, the kind of writing that forensic accountants develop when they understand that documents outlive the intentions of the people who create them, and so must be legible to strangers who come later. She had dated the first entry 12 years ago, 3 months after they married, and the entry described the original purpose of the document in 2 clean sentences that said everything about who she was. This record exists to separate what is honest from what is not. It is not a weapon. It is a map. Adrian read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then he closed the ledger. He sat with the weight of it in his hands. 12 years of his wife's precise, patient, undervalued labor. 12 years of truth told to a ledger because the person it was meant for wasn't ready to hear it. 12 years of a woman who had loved him thoroughly enough to document everything he needed to protect himself, even from himself. The most powerful person in Adrian Vale's world had always been sitting across from him. He had just never looked up long enough to see it. Tomorrow the board would convene, and the investigators would file, and Bernard Holt would give his accounting, and whatever came of all of it would come. There would be consequences that couldn't be avoided, and decisions that couldn't be reversed, and a marriage that couldn't be repaired, and an empire that would have to be rebuilt from something more honest than what it had been built on the first time. All of that was tomorrow. Tonight, Adrian Vale sat alone in his boardroom with his wife's life's work in his hands, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he was not trying to manage the moment. He was simply in it. The board meeting started at 9 a.m. and did not end until 2:40 in the afternoon. Adrian walked in carrying no prepared remarks, no slide presentation, no carefully staged narrative designed to control what the 11 board members took away from the room. He carried Carol Freed's report, Bernard Holt's preliminary accounting, and the truth unmanaged, unfiltered, and complete. Diana Marsh sat beside him. Cole sat against the wall, not at the table, because Cole had no official board position, and both of them understood that this was not a moment for optics or the appearance of reinforcement. Adrian sat at the head of the table alone and opened the meeting by saying something none of the 11 people in that room had ever heard him say in 12 years of quarterly briefings and annual reviews. I owe you a complete accounting of what has happened inside this organization, not a managed version of it, not a version designed to protect my position, the full picture. And then you'll make whatever decisions you determine are appropriate, and I will accept them. The room was very quiet. A board member named Hargrove, who had been on the Vale Meridian board for 9 years, and who had a reputation for asking the question everyone else was thinking, but managing not to say, looked at Adrian and said, "Is this the part where you tell us you're resigning?" "No," Adrian said. "This is the part where I tell you everything and let you decide whether I should be." He talked for 4 hours. He walked them through Gavin's fraudulent transactions, with Carol's documentation as the backbone. He walked them through the subsidiary structure and the Nevada properties and the parallel empire that had been constructed underneath Vale Meridian's legitimate operations. He walked them through the authority transfers surrounding his father's final year, the medical timeline, the legal window, and Bernard Holt's voluntary accounting of exactly how that window had been identified and used. He answered every question directly, including the ones that reflected badly on his own judgment, his own blind spots, his own 12 years of trusting a man who had been building a betrayal since before Adrian had fully grown into the role he'd inherited. At 12:30, Hargrove asked the question that had been building in the room for 3 hours. "Mr. Vale, the ledger that forms the evidentiary foundation of Carol Freed's report that was built by your wife." "Yes," Adrian said, "who is currently in separation proceedings with you?" "Yes." "Over a period of 12 years?" "Yes." "While you were running this organization?" "Yes." Hargrove looked at him steadily. "And you were unaware of its full contents until 4 days ago?" Adrian did not look away. "That's correct. She built a complete forensic record of your organization's financial architecture, identified a 38-month fraud scheme, documented the misuse of your personal authorization credentials, found evidence connecting your consigliere to the manipulation of your father's succession, and she did all of this independently, without organizational resources, without your knowledge, and despite 3 separate attempts to bring it to your attention that you dismissed." "Yes," Adrian said. "That is an accurate summary." The room was very quiet. "Mr. Vale," Hargrove said, and his voice shifted slightly, not softer but different, more human. "What does that tell you about how this organization has been valuing the people who actually keep it running?" The question landed with the weight of something that had been true for a very long time, and was only now being spoken in a room with the authority to act on it. Adrian looked at Hargrove. He thought about Linda at her logistics coordinator desk, raising concerns for a year and a half, and being told it was being handled. He thought about Braddock loyal for 30 years, and never once asked what he actually saw from where he stood. He thought about Cole's younger brother, watching and absorbing and staying quiet, because the room had always belonged to Adrian, and the person Gavin had carefully positioned beside him. He thought about Natalie. "It tells me," Adrian said, "that this organization has been structured to make the person at the top feel powerful, and the people keeping everything functional feel invisible, and that a man who spent 30 years exploiting that structure nearly destroyed everything because of it." He paused. "I intend to change that, starting with this meeting today, and with whatever decisions you make about my leadership at the end of it." Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Then Hargrove looked at the other 10 board members. The vote at 2:15 p.m. was 7-4 in favor of retaining Adrian's leadership under a formal restructuring agreement that included mandatory independent governance, quarterly external auditing, the addition of 3 new independent board members, and a formal review of every operational role connected to Gavin Rourke's former sphere of influence. Adrian accepted every condition without negotiation. Hargrove, walking out at 2:40, stopped beside Adrian in the hallway. "For what it's worth," Hargrove said quietly, "the 4 who voted against you weren't voting against what you said today. They were voting against what you've been for the last 12 years. He paused. "The 7 who voted for you were voting for the person who walked into that room this morning." Adrian nodded. "I understand the difference," he said. Cole was waiting in the corridor outside. He looked at Adrian's face and immediately read the result. 7-4, Adrian said before Cole could ask. Cole exhaled. Okay, that's workable." "It's more than workable," Adrian said. "It's exactly what should have happened." He started walking. "Call Carol Freed. I want the full investigation timeline. And call the HR director. We're starting the operational review today, not next week." Cole fell into step beside him. "Adrian," Cole said. "Yeah, you did good in there." Adrian thought about it. "I told the truth," he said. "That's not the same as doing good. That's just the minimum." He paused. "But it's a start." 3 weeks later, Gavin Rourke formally accepted a cooperation agreement with federal investigators. The agreement required him to provide complete documentation of his activities over the preceding 15 years in exchange for consideration in sentencing. His attorneys had spent 2 weeks looking for leverage and had found none. Carol Freed's documentation was too thorough, Bernard Holt's accounting too detailed, and the banking metadata too precise to create the ambiguity that effective negotiation required. Bernard Holt's voluntary accounting took 11 days to complete. The resulting document was 204 pages. It included the letters written in Victor Vale's handwriting during the period of the authority transfers. 7 letters, total 3 of which contained language that made clear Victor had understood he was signing documents under significant pressure, and had believed based on Gavin's explicit assurances that the transfers were temporary administrative arrangements that would be reversed once his health stabilized. They were never reversed. Victor Vale died 4 months after signing the last letter. Adrian read all 7 letters in his private study on a Tuesday evening alone with the door closed and his phone turned face down on the desk. Cole had offered to be there. Adrian had thanked him and said no. This was something he needed to do by himself, in the specific way that certain reckonings can only happen in private, where there is no one watching and no performance required, and the full weight of the thing can land exactly as heavily as it actually is. He read the last letter twice, in Victor Vale's increasingly unsteady handwriting. The letter said, "I am trusting that Gavin will manage this responsibly. I am trusting that Adrian will be protected. I am trusting that the family I built will hold together after I am gone. I am trusting because I do not have the strength left to verify." Adrian set the letter down. He sat for a long time in the silence of his study. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother. Evelyn Vale answered immediately. "I read them," Adrian said. A pause. "All of them. All of them." He heard her breathe. "He trusted Gavin," Evelyn said. Her voice was completely steady in the way of a woman who has already done her grieving privately and has come to the phone prepared to be present for her son. "He trusted Gavin," Adrian said, "and Gavin used that trust to take everything Dad thought he was protecting." He stopped. "Mom, Dad didn't abandon the organization. He didn't hand it to me carelessly. He was betrayed by the person he trusted most while he was too sick to defend himself." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I knew your father better than anyone alive," she said, "and I have spent 12 years wondering whether he fully understood what he was leaving behind and what he was leaving you with." Her voice shifted slightly. "Now I know." "Yes," Adrian said. "He was protecting you," Evelyn said, "even when he couldn't." "Yes," Adrian said again. They stayed on the phone for a while after that, not saying much, just the comfortable silence of people who are sitting with something large and painful and true and don't need to fill the space around it with words. It was, Adrian thought, the most honest conversation he had ever had with his mother, which said something about the conversations they had been having for the previous 12 years. When he hung up, he sat for another hour. Then he picked up a pen and a piece of paper, actual paper, not a phone, not a laptop, and he wrote a note. Not long. 11 sentences. He folded it and put it in an envelope and wrote Natalie's name on the outside. And the next morning he gave it to Rachel Monroe's office with instructions that it was personal correspondence and should be delivered at Natalie's discretion, not forwarded through legal channels. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks after the board meeting. Natalie did not want the estate. She did not want the cars or the accounts or any of the architecture of a life that had never fully felt like hers. She accepted what the law said she was entitled to, from 12 years of marriage, declined the additional settlement Adrian offered twice through their respective attorneys, and walked out of the legal process the same way she had walked out of the anniversary dinner, carrying only what belonged to her and leaving the rest precisely where it lay. Rachel had argued gently that she was leaving money on the table. Natalie had said, "I know, I'm leaving it there on purpose." Rachel had looked at her for a moment. "Because taking it would feel like payment," Rachel said, not a question. "Because taking it would feel like the 12 years had a price," Natalie said. "And they didn't. They had a cost. Those are different things." 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Monroe and Bennett Integrity Partners opened its doors in a modest suite of offices in a building on Michigan Avenue that Natalie had chosen specifically because it was nothing like Vale Meridian's headquarters in every way that mattered. No marble, no performance of power, clean lines, good light, and enough space for the work. Rachel had resisted the partnership name at first. "It should have your name first," Rachel said. "You're the one who brought the practice area." "It was your practice first," Natalie said. "And I'm not interested in whose name is larger on the door. I'm interested in what happens inside the rooms." The firm's founding philosophy was straightforward: help family-owned companies and closely held organizations identify financial abuse, hidden internal conflicts, and structural vulnerabilities before they became catastrophic. Natalie wrote the practice framework herself in 2 weeks. It drew on 12 years of experience managing the legitimate side of an organization that had been compromised from inside, and it was specific and practical and built for the kind of problems that most accounting firms didn't recognize until the damage was done. The first client came through Rachel's existing network, a mid-sized manufacturing company in Milwaukee, whose founders suspected their CFO of misappropriating funds, but couldn't prove it without an external investigator. They trusted enough to give access to the complete records. Natalie spent 3 weeks on the engagement. She found the misappropriation inside the first week and spent the remaining 2 weeks documenting it in a way that would survive legal scrutiny. The founders looked at her report and one of them said, "How did you know exactly where to look?" Natalie almost said, "Because I've been looking at hidden things inside complicated organizations for 12 years. Instead, she said, "Because people who move money dishonestly follow patterns, and patterns leave marks." The second client came through Carol Freed's recommendation. The third through a referral from Diana Marsh. By the fourth month of operation, the firm had 6 active engagements and a waiting list. Natalie worked long hours and felt none of the exhaustion that had become her baseline during the final years at the Vale estate. The difference was not the hours. The difference was that the work belonged to her. Every decision, every finding, every document she built under the Monroe and Bennett name was hers, not in the service of someone else's protection, not presented to the world under someone else's authority, not quietly absorbed into a larger narrative where her contribution disappeared. She was building something that had her name on it, even if it was on the second line of the door. It was enough. It was more than enough. At 4 months after the divorce, something arrived at her office through Rachel that she hadn't expected. A handwritten note, 11 sentences, in an envelope with her name in Adrian's handwriting. She held it for a long moment before opening it. She had read the note he'd sent through Rachel's office weeks earlier, the one with the Atlas ledger, but she hadn't responded and she hadn't planned to. There was a version of herself that believed the cleanest path forward was complete silence, that any continued contact was a door she should leave firmly closed. But she opened the envelope. The note was not an appeal. It was not a negotiation or an attempt to reopen what had been closed. It was 11 sentences that said, with the stripped-down directness of a man who had spent several months learning to say things without managing how they landed exactly what he meant. He had verified what happened to Victor. He had put the full findings on the legal record. He had spoken at Victor's graveside privately, just himself and Cole and Evelyn, and had said the things that needed saying about what his father had actually been and what had actually been taken from him. He was rebuilding the company under new governance, and it was hard and uncomfortable and right. He was grateful for the truth she had carried long enough for him to finally be ready to receive it. He was not asking for anything. He was telling her because she deserved to know the things she had set in motion had landed the way they were supposed to, and because telling her was the honest thing to do. The last sentence was, "You were right about everything, and I am sorry it took me so long to look." Natalie read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer that she reserved for things that mattered. She did not call him. She did not write back immediately. She sat with it for 2 days the way she sat with everything that required careful thought, not avoiding it, not letting it become larger than it was, just giving it the space and time it needed before she knew what, if anything, she wanted to do with it. On the third day she wrote back, 4 sentences. "Thank you for telling me about Victor. He deserved the truth on the record. I hope the company becomes what it should have always been. Take care of yourself, Adrian." She sent it through Rachel's office. Rachel read the outgoing message with the careful neutrality of a professional and the quiet warmth of a 20-year friend. 4 sentences, Rachel said. 4 sentences is what was necessary, Natalie said. Rachel nodded and sent it. 6 months after the firm opened, Natalie received an invitation to speak at a financial accountability conference in downtown Chicago. The conference organizer, who had heard about the Monroe and Bennett practice through Carol Freed's professional network, wanted Natalie to address what the invitation described as the invisible labor problem in organizational finance, the pattern of highly skilled people doing critical protective work inside organizations while receiving no official recognition, authority, or credit for it. Natalie read the invitation 3 times, then she accepted. She spent 2 weeks preparing the talk. She did not write a script. She wrote an outline and let the talk be what it needed to be: direct, specific, and built from real experience rather than theoretical frameworks. She did not mention Adrian. She did not mention organized crime or the Vale estate or the anniversary dinner or the black leather case or any of the specific details of the specific story that had brought her to this particular moment in this particular office preparing this particular talk. She didn't need to. The room held 200 financial professionals, corporate attorneys, compliance officers, and business owners. She stood at the front of it without notes and spoke for 47 minutes. She talked about invisible labor. She talked about the people inside organizations who solve crises before those crises become visible, who protect institutional knowledge, who carry the weight of operational continuity, while the people with titles receive the credit for the continuity. She talked about what happens to organizations when those people are consistently undervalued, not just to the people themselves, but to the organization, which becomes dependent on a resource it has stopped recognizing and therefore stops protecting. She talked about the specific danger of organizations that mistake loyalty for invisibility, that take the quiet competence of their most capable people as permission to keep demanding it, without acknowledgement, without authority, without the basic respect of being heard when something is wrong. She did not say this happened to me. She said this happens. It happens in family companies and closely held organizations, and in every structure where power is concentrated in ways that make it comfortable for the person at the center to stop looking at what holds them up. She said being needed is not the same as being valued, and the difference between those two things is the distance between a person who stays and a person who eventually picks up their coat and walks out the door and takes with them everything they were carrying that nobody saw. The room was completely quiet when she finished. Then it was not quiet at all. 3 people approached her directly afterward. A woman who ran a family manufacturing company and said quietly and privately, "I think I'm the person you were describing, not the one who leaves, the one who stays and isn't seen." A compliance officer from a regional bank who said he was going to put her framework in front of his board. A young financial analyst, maybe 25 years old, who said simply, "I needed to hear that today. Thank you." Natalie talked to each of them. She gave the young analyst her card. She told the woman from the manufacturing company, "You already know what you need to do. You're just waiting until it feels safer. It won't feel safer. It will feel right." The woman looked at her with the expression of someone receiving a truth they have already privately arrived at, but needed to hear from another person to make it real. "How do you know?" the woman asked. "Because I waited too," Natalie said. 7 months after the divorce. Adrian walked into a small conference room in a building on Michigan Avenue for the first time. Natalie had agreed to meet. Not because she owed him anything, not because the story required a reunion, but because Adrian had been doing the work, actually doing it, not performing it, and because she was not a person who confused forgiveness with weakness, or believed that closing a door meant you could never look at it again. Rachel had arranged the meeting at Natalie's office, on Natalie's ground under Natalie's terms in the building where Natalie had built something that belonged entirely to her. Adrian walked in and looked around the office with the attention of a man who was looking at something real and trying to understand it fully. It was not the office of a woman consoling herself after a loss. It was the office of a woman who had found something worth building and had started building it. He sat down across from her. He looked different. She had noticed it in the conference room at Rachel's office 7 months ago. But it was more settled now, less of a change in progress and more of a change completed. Less performance, more person. The particular change that happens to someone who has been living honestly for long enough that it becomes their natural state rather than their effort. "The company," she said, "starting with what was safe. Surviving," he said. "Actually surviving, not just appearing to. The independent governance structure is uncomfortable, and I'm not in control of as much as I used to be, which apparently is the point." A brief, dry expression that was not quite a smile, but was the ghost of his old dry humor. "Hargrove told me last month that the board's confidence in the operational direction is higher than it's been in years," which he said with the specific satisfaction of a man who voted for you once and has been right about it ever since. "Hargrove was always the sharpest one in that room," Natalie said. "I know that now," Adrian said. "I knew it then too. I just didn't like it." A beat. "Your mother?" Natalie asked. "Better," he said. "Reading the letters about Dad was hard for her. Harder than I expected, which I should have expected it. But knowing what actually happened has given her something to do with the grief she's been carrying. She was angry for a while, really angry in a way I'd never seen from her. Then she was sad." He paused. "Now she's mostly focused on making sure the record about Dad is as complete as possible. She's been working with the investigators on the historical documentation." "That sounds like Evelyn," Natalie said. "It does," he agreed. "She asked about you." Natalie looked at him. "She wants you to know," he said carefully, "that she should have seen what you were doing more clearly than she did. That she should have said something sooner. She didn't write it in a letter. She told me to tell you in person, because she said letters are what people use when they want to say something without having to see the person's face when they say it." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "Tell her that I understood," she said, "and that I never held it against her. She'll be glad to hear that." The room was quiet for a moment. The work, Adrian said. He gestured a small, careful gesture toward the office around them. How is it? And Natalie, for the first time in the conversation, let something that was genuinely hers move through her expression. Not performed contentment, not managed satisfaction. Real. It's good, she said. It's genuinely good. I heard you spoke at the accountability conference. Yes. Carol Freed told me about it, he said. She said you didn't name any names. No, Natalie said. The story doesn't belong to me alone to tell, and the point wasn't the story. The point was the pattern. Adrian looked at her. You're doing for other people, he said slowly, what you spent 12 years doing for me. Except this time, you're doing it on your terms. On my terms, she confirmed, for people who know I'm doing it, who ask for it and thank me for it and put my name on the work I produce. She held his gaze. It turns out that's a significantly more sustainable arrangement. He nodded. The nod of a man who understands completely and has no defense to offer and isn't looking for one. I'm glad, he said, and he meant it. She could see that he meant it, which was the thing that had changed most fundamentally about Adrian Vale. He had become a person whose words and face said the same thing at the same time because he had stopped having enough energy to maintain the gap between them. Adrian, she said. Yeah. I want to ask you something. He waited. The man who sat in that boardroom and told 11 people the complete truth about what happened in his organization, she said. The man who read his father's letters alone and then called his mother. The man who walked through his operations floor and talked to Linda. She paused. Where was he for the last 12 years? The question was not cruel. It was not rhetorical. It was the question she had been carrying since the night of the anniversary dinner, since the 3 emails he had left unread, since every quiet crisis she had absorbed without acknowledgement, and every warning she had given that went unheard. Adrian sat with the question. He sat with it long enough that she knew he was not going to manage his way to an answer that protected him. How was there? Adrian said finally. He was always there. He stopped. He was surrounded by structures that made it easier to perform strength than to actually use it. And he had a person next to him who was carrying everything he should have been carrying himself, which meant he never had to develop the muscle for it. He looked at her. I built a version of myself that fit the world Gavin designed. The world where the person at the top never questions the loyalty beneath him, never looks too closely at the foundation, never acknowledges vulnerability, because vulnerability looks like weakness, and weakness looks like opportunity to the kind of people Gavin made sure I was surrounded by. Natalie nodded slowly. And the person who warned you about all of that, she said, was the one person Gavin needed me not to trust, Adrian said, so he made sure I didn't, and I let him, because it was easier than looking. The room held that between them. Forgiveness, Natalie said, doesn't mean returning. She had said it to him once before. He had heard it. He had understood it. Now he was sitting across from her in the evidence that it was true in the office that was hers, in the work that was hers in the version of Natalie Vale that existed only because she had finally stopped waiting for the permission to become her. I know, he said. I don't hate you, she said. I know that too. I think you are capable of being the person you've been for the last 7 months for the rest of your life, she said. I think the work you've been doing is real. I think the changes inside Vale Meridian are real. I think you finally understand what power actually costs and what it actually requires. She paused. And I think none of that changes what the last 12 years were. No, he agreed. It doesn't. So, he said. They sat for a moment in the clean, honest space of 2 people who have said the most important things and have arrived at the particular peace that comes not from resolution, but from truth fully told and fully received. The Atlas Ledger, Adrian said. I know, she said. You sent it back. I sent it back because it was always yours, he said. I should have said that in the note. It was always yours. You built it, you carried it, you used it to tell the truth when telling the truth cost you something real. He looked at her steadily. I just wanted you to have it back. Natalie thought about the ledger sitting in the evidence archive at Carol Freed's firm, properly filed, properly documented, its full evidentiary chain intact and complete. She thought about the night she had carried it out of the Vale estate in a black leather case, and the anniversary dinner, and the ring beside the wine glass, and the 4 words she had spoken that had been the beginning of everything. I won't fight for you anymore. She had meant it completely. She still meant it. And it had never meant what Adrian initially thought it meant, never meant I stopped caring, never meant I want you destroyed, never meant this is revenge. It had meant I will no longer carry your weight for you. I will no longer absorb your consequences. I will no longer make myself smaller so that your world has room to believe it is entirely yours. I will no longer save you from yourself, because a person who is always saved from themselves never learns to stand on their own ground. And Adrian Vale was standing on his own ground now. It had cost both of them enormously to get there. Natalie stood up. Adrian stood too. They shook hands at the door of her office, a strange and honest gesture, the gesture of two people who have moved through something transformative together and have come out on the other side as different people who respect each other and have no more claim on each other's futures. "Take care of your company," she said. "Take care of your firm," he said. She watched him leave. She stood in the doorway of her office for a moment after he was gone and looked at the space he had occupied, the chair. The table, the small square of floor where Adrian Vale had sat and told the truth and left without asking for anything. Then she went back to her desk. There were 3 client files waiting. A family business in Indiana with unexplained liquidity gaps. A regional logistics company with a CFO whose expense reporting didn't match the company's operational footprint. A newly formed partnership with a founding agreement that had enough structural ambiguity to become catastrophic within 3 years if nobody caught it now. She opened the first file. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel, conference organizer, wants to know if you'll do a longer keynote at the spring event. 45 minutes plus Q&A. Natalie read it and typed back, yes. Then she put the phone down and read the first page of the Indiana file with the complete attention of a woman who has found the work that is entirely and only hers and who brings to it 12 years of experience and forensic precision and the hard-earned wisdom of someone who has learned the difference between being needed and being valued, and who has chosen clearly, finally, and without regret, to only do work that is both. 1 year after the night she walked out of the Vale estate, Natalie Vale stood at the front of a conference room in downtown Chicago and looked at 200 people who had come to hear her speak about the things that organizations miss when they stop looking at the people who hold them up. She was not the mafia boss's wife. She was not the woman who had been publicly humiliated at her own anniversary dinner. She was not the person who had spent 12 years carrying someone else's weight in someone else's house. She was Natalie Vale, founding partner of Monroe and Bennett Integrity Partners, forensic accountant builder of records that told the truth when everyone around her had been living comfortably inside a lie. She was the woman who had walked out the door carrying the one thing no one in that room had recognized as the most valuable thing on the table, not the ledger, her own clarity. And she had walked out with it quietly, completely, and without a single backward glance, because women who finally understand their own value do not look back at the rooms that failed to see it. They build better rooms, and they make sure this time that their name is on the door.